I'm Cynthia Canner, Executive Director of the Environmental Defenders of McHenry County, and really want to thank our Water and Natural Resources Protection Committee, its Chair Cindy Skrukrud and Nancy Sheetzelt, for organizing this really wonderful workshop opportunity. And we have a really nice mix of people, from solar companies to garden companies, and we look forward to everyone's questions during the workshop and to our special speakers we have lined up for you. So just welcome everybody, and return to this room on April 22nd, Earth Day, for a movie called Earth Days. We'd like to fill the auditorium. This is a wonderful opportunity, and we wish you the best during Earth Month. We have a lot of things going on, so check our calendar. And without further ado, our speakers.
I'm Cindy Skrukrud. I chair, as Cynthia said, I chair our Water and Natural Resources Committee here at the Defenders. And wanted to say a few things about the nexus of this workshop today. When the Future Energy Jobs Act got passed in Illinois, we all knew that there would be lots of proposals for solar farms coming to McHenry County and coming to Illinois, and we were really insistent that they incorporate native plants into their landscaping, because we felt that would just add so much to the habitat and the protection of our water resources here in McHenry County and throughout the state. So we lobbied our county to require the planting of native plants on solar farms, and they've moved ahead with that. And so we wanted to have this workshop today to bring together solar developers with folks who have a lot of expertise in native plantings and restorations, just so we can have a good sharing of everyone's expertise and knowledge, because we want these solar farms to succeed. So I'm very excited. We have a great group of speakers today, so I'm excited for you to hear from them. Our first speaker is Colleen Hollinger, and she's with Prairie Restorations out of Minnesota. And we saw a webinar online, looked at their website online, and we said, wow, this would be a great company to come and talk about their experience. So Colleen and Prairie Restorations, Inc. have worked with their solar partners over the past 5 years in the promotion, public relations, and neighbor communications of their projects to further native, pollinator-friendly solar sites throughout the Midwest. She will address how solar with native sites can be financially beneficial for developers and environmentally significant for the greater community. She'll also share the experiences they've learned using native, pollinator-friendly habitat under solar panels and the research that they are continuing to conduct. So really excited to have Colleen here.
Thank you, good morning, and thanks everyone for being here. And I especially want to thank Environmental Defenders. They attended every county hearing and planning commission meeting that was happening all across the county to really, through the last year, to make sure that they could accomplish what they did was really requiring that every solar array be native pollinator friendly, and that's a huge accomplishment. So congratulations to all the Defender members who are here. You've contributed to the greater good for the next 25 years, at least, in the life of a normal solar array. So that slide's for you. First off, I'm going to go through and talk about what are the things that I'll cover, and Cindy kind of gave an overview. I want to define what is native habitat, why natives, the U.S. studies that are currently happening really on the federal and local level, site learnings that I think for you solar developers in the room will find it particularly helpful, and then finally just some components for permitting and ag land preservation that will be helpful for both county individuals and if you're on the planning commission or a county representative, but also the developers. This is a little tricky of a presentation because originally it was for solar developers, and now we've got some real rock star environmentalists and biologists in the room, so it's a little bit of a conundrum, but there we are. And one of the things that I do want to tell you about is, there are some things that are okay to substitute. When you don't have half and half, you can substitute cream, and it works just great. There are other things like trying to substitute non-natives for natives. From my world where we come from, we really, really believe in that there's really no substitution for natives. Nature has evolved over thousands of years, and really that balance really, really works. And with that, I want to tell you just a very short story. I went to REI about 2 months ago because I was hearing about these puffer jackets, the lightweight down jackets that everybody has. And I bought one, and I loved it so much I wore it skiing, carrying dog food into the house, every time I went to the car. And before I came here, I thought it was kind of showing a little patina, like I was wearing it a lot. So I followed the directions, put it in the washer and then the dryer. And last night when I checked into the hotel here, I was filling out the paperwork, and the hotel clerk said, "It kind of smells like an Italian restaurant in here." And my brain did this slow replay back, and I'm looking at her and you're having in your mind. So I followed the directions, but I'm not a tennis player, and it says in the dryer, put 2 new tennis balls in with the coat. And I know from experience that golf balls don't substitute for tennis balls in your dryer. So I'm kind of casting around looking for what I can use. And I'm just going to tell you that my focus group of 1, large garlic heads and athletic socks in the dryer with your jacket is not a good substitute. So let's talk about what pollinator friendly is. In the industry, we use the word forbs, and that is plants with flowers on it. So you'll oftentimes hear the conversation of forbs and grasses. A native pollinary friendly solar is really first and primarily a solar site. Everything that we do on the site is there to provide support and make that solar site efficient and productive. Of course, we believe our mission is important, that we're a mission-driven company, but the reason for us to be there is that solar site. So we really work to make all of our management and any seed specifications really work so that that solar site is productive. So primarily solar site. Second, creating meaningful habitat. Here in Illinois, we want to create meaningful habitat that restores the soil, provides habitat for insects, butterflies, songbirds, game birds, and small mammals. So now that we have pollinator friendly and we have solar developer A plant a perimeter of pollinator around the edge of their 10 or 20 acres, and I can forward these slides, so if you all don't want to take pictures, I can just make them available to the defenders.
Colleen, could you point out this will be there'll be a video of this on the defender's website probably early next week. So the Matt back there is filming as this goes on, so you can just watch that.
Did you all hear that? It'll be available on the defender's website. Yeah, that'll make your time a little more relaxing here today. So solar developer A has 20 acres. They plant a perimeter of pollinators around the edge. Solar developer B invests in researches and plants the entire array in pollinators. Can both claim to be pollinator friendly? That's why we've developed the scorecard. I'm proud that Minnesota was the originator of the scorecard. I will tell you, the University of Illinois has taken the Minnesota scorecard and I think ramped it up a bit, and they've done a really great job. Professor from entomology, Adam DeLazo, had a good description. It's science-based, and it's a way that developers have a level playing field, so we're all measuring by the same standards. An example of this in the scorecard is what percentage of the land is planted, or the solar site, is planted in natives? What is planted in non-natives? You get dinged for non-natives. Are there other native blooming shrubs nearby? Shrubs are often, and trees are often the first thing to bloom in the spring, so you're having forage for the early insects, pollinating insects. Shrubs and trees will bloom and provide that early season pollen that really helps boost the insects' beginnings in the early season. For the biologists and the environmentalists in the room, you know this, but for a lot of us, this is an amazing and accurate description of why natives? Why do we want to plant natives? Why don't we just go the easy, cheap route and plant turf grass? We certainly know turf grass thrives. It's often from Europe and it's non-native. Just beneath the solar panel bracing there, you can see what is really this like Kentucky bluegrass, a turf grass. 3 inches of roots that come down into the soil compared to the blazing star or little blue stem. The next slide I'll show you, but what those roots do is create beautiful little cavities throughout the soil that help to break up the soil. And when the rainfall comes down, it follows into the soil and it follows those cavities, nurturing those plants. And then whatever the plants don't use and the soil doesn't retain, it goes down into and replenishes the aquifer. When you have deep root systems, that water follows deep into the soil, holds the soil in place, prevents erosion. When you have 3 inches of roots, the water will fill up the 3 inches, and then we know it sheets up and often will drain off. And in this instance, out commonly in ag fields, rather than replenishing the aquifer, we suddenly have that rainwater sheeting off into drainage ditches and small creeks. So this is why natives matter. This is why they work on solar arrays. They hold the soil in place. At the end of 25 years, you'll be returning back to the landowner more land that is largely organic and is decompacted and rich in nutrients. Isn't this great? So there's the example, and it's an amazing cutaway. So little blue stem, you know, that obviously bigger than that probably 6 foot tall individual standing there. So that's just a great example of why natives really, there's no substitute for them. Sleep, creep, leap. So this is a phrase that we use about natives when we are trying to help manage expectations for both residential and corporate. If you've seen prairies a land restored back to native, a lot of times the first 3 years it's really messy looking. We don't say weedy because it's native plants, but it is messy, and it's the nature of it. The first year, the plant is really like an iceberg. It's creating that initial root system, putting just a few leaves up above the soil. Same with the second year. It might have even a bloom on that second year. The third year, that plant leaps ahead, explodes, because it's developed this beautiful root system all down below the soil. As a solar developer, there is no maintenance-free environment. And we do hear that. We want it to be maintenance-free, of course, because you want to not spend money on your O&M budget. There is no maintenance-free environment. For your first 3 years, plan on 3 visits. Plan that you're going to have 2 mowings and probably 1 site visit that would be spot spraying, might be hand weeding with a weed whip, but plan 3 visits in your budget. Year 4, likely 2 visits, and then here's where the beauty comes in. Year 5, through the life of the array, 0 to 1.5 visits. If you budget for 1.5, you're golden on most of your budget, unless something odd and unusual would happen. Studies that are going on. National Renewable Energy Lab is conducting a couple different studies around the United States. 2 of them are in Minnesota. Prairie Restorations did the control mix, and here's what we're trying to figure out is, what do we do with that shade line that's underneath the solar array that's a pretty constant, even with fixed and even with tracking solar panels? So from Prairie Restoration's perspective, we've always been only natives, only natives, only natives. We're learning that when you have full sun, which the forbs love and the grasses love, what happens underneath that constant shade line? The natives aren't, they're surviving, they're not doing great. What we've been researching on our part, and what this study is doing too, is using fescues and shade-tolerant grasses that are native to North America, but maybe not native to the ecoregion that these solar sites are in. So on solar sites, it's a never say never, and we are doing our own studies with a couple of our solar partners to really learn what's going to be best, especially under those shade sections that will thrive, put down deep roots, hold the soil in place. U.S. Department of Energy is also doing several studies. They're comparing low-growing ag crops, such as squash and pumpkins, that are, of course, specifically, they occur because they've been pollinated. So we've created the pollinator habitat. What does it mean to invite the ag crops? Of course, from my perspective, I love natives, but the DOE is doing those studies, and we want to see and learn what comes out of that. So here's that shade line. This happens to be a picture of a fixed array, and that constant shade line is there. It does present a challenge. The forbs will survive in there, but they're not going to thrive, and they eventually will move out of that area. One thing that we love to see as a restoration management, vegetation management company is 30-inch minimum on that bottom edge. If we're able to have 30 inches, we can provide a lot of plant diversity. There's a lot of prairie plants that grow taller than that, but there's also a great selection of that grow under the 30 inches. We're seeing with climate change too, that the 30 inches makes a difference not only with the plants, but also with some of these massive snowfalls that we're getting, when there have been experiences of tracking panels overnight getting, they go back into the stow mode overnight, and when they try to pop up in the morning, snow drifts have essentially locked them into place when the panels are mounted too low to the ground. 24 inches is really kind of the minimum. Anything below that, and I think you're really risking more snow load issues and definitely sacrificing diversity on the plantings. One other thing about the 30 inches is it allows us to travel through and mow and manage the sites without having, it reduces the risk to panel damage. And that's really, slower management means more time, means more money. So we really try to encourage that 30-inch minimum. 36 is great. And you've been seeing images of what native habitat arrays look like. This is a site in, obviously, Acadia, Wisconsin, and a tracking site, and we have nice diversity there, and it's healthy on its way to being a low-maintenance solar array. Planning and pre-planning on solar sites, and just like anything, before you're going to paint your living room, doing the prep saves you lots of headaches later. Doing the prep on the solar sites saves you, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars as a solar owner and developer. In McHenry County, it's a little more of a challenge to remove the gravel on the surface. We're hoping that if, what we would suggest is a lot of times when the earthwork firm comes in, if they're stripping the soil away, setting that aside and then bringing that back in so that you don't see gravel on the surface, because as careful as any of us try to be, this is what happens when we mow, and we don't want to have to see that. So that prep, the proper planning and prep will really make a difference through the life of the array. So this is a young industry. We know that solar is just starting in Illinois. It's been in Minnesota for a few years. One of the things that I'm going to push back onto the engineers the engineers that are working with solar arrays is they have great education on construction, but not necessarily a lot of experience with developing solar sites. So They know the water, they know soil bearings, they know steel strength. What happens when we don't have conversations with those engineers and what needs to occur on a solar site is imagine trying to manage that section of the fence with a tractor mowing for 25 years. And imagine what you have to do instead is you have to get off and use a weed whip for 25 years. So that equates to more money, and when a solar developer puts out a bid for management and then wonders why the natives, why it's not low maintenance, why is it so expensive? This is why it's so expensive. So really the pre-planning, when you sit down with your project manager and the engineer, talk through what your expectations are and what you're going to need as a solar owner. This is another example, and if you ever have driven on a tractor or a riding lawnmower, what do you think about that pitch behind those trees? Right. A lot of times we don't mow outside the array at all anyway. In this case, we won't mow outside the array. This berm was installed to try to improve screening, which is another topic I'm going to cover. But that pitch continues all the way down inside, and so not only do we have a pitch inside the array, but we also have pinch points everywhere. You see the top edge of the panel and the fence. So once again, how would you get through there with a tractor or even a riding lawnmower for 25 years? This was another well-intentioned engineer trying to save money by not burying cables. We came across this one, and so our project manager, he's like, yeah, so how do we deal with this? You know, really well-intentioned, but that's where, you know, having the engineer have a conversation. So not only can we not get through there to seed it, we can't get through there with a tractor and a lawnmower. The solution, we go down the right side to mow, back out, turn around, and then back in on the left side, get out with the weed whip around, you know, to keep the invasives out those first 3 years until the prairie takes over, and then go forward. Times every row over 10 acres for the next 3 years. And that's why we struggle when it's like, why are natives expensive? It's not, it's that pre-planning, sit down and talk through. Imagine, so this is the same site in that junction box. Now imagine just even 5 years of habitat growing, and you know, habitat is going to grow up and around for any sort of management firm to get in there and keep weeds from going, or keep plants from going into the junction box. It's not only unsafe, but it's really time consuming. So that's where all of those cables really need to be buried. And it's safer for everyone, and it keeps your O&M budget low. So in Minnesota, one thing that is, I'm hoping is on a little bubble is this whole notion that change, and I moved to the country because I want to see corn. I don't want to see I don't want to see this solar array because I feel like it's industrial looking. You know, I'm biased, we all are. I love a solar array because for the next 25 years, that solar array is a deep blue black, silent, quiet neighbor. And I'm happy to see it, especially when it looks like some of those earlier slides that I showed you with the sea of flowers blooming and changing from May all the way through September. One thing that some counties have allowed to have happen in Minnesota, and we've learned is, so this site shows a berm. So imagine taking soil, piling up, and how are you going to get that soil to stay in place? You're going to pack it really tight, and you're going to pack it some more, and then you're going to try to put something on there that grows on that really packed soil, and then you're going to come and take a tree auger, and you're going to dig a hole in the very top of it, and then you're going to plant a tree in there. And then when it rains, that hole, because it's been in packed soil, is going to hold like a barrel, and now you want those $300 pine trees to survive. We took this picture because we knew that by the end of that summer, those trees are going to be dead, and all 100% of them died. That's an expensive, you know, it's like putting $100 bills through a shredder. You'd have more fun watching them come out the back end. So really, the alternative to that is if a county and the neighbors really feel like they need to have screening on particular sections that they pass by, plant the pine trees on ground level, cluster them with native trees and shrubs. Again, some of those shrubs will be blooming shrubs that provide that early spring forage for native insects. And it's a much more natural arrangement, and over time, the pine trees will help screen. I really do think it's a bubble. People will suddenly realize that solar is a gift, and we are reducing pollutants in the air, and we are really accomplishing a lot by having solar arrays, and they will get used to the sight of them. You know, I personally don't find strip malls surrounded by asphalt very attractive, but we don't screen those with trees, but we have to, you know, screen solar arrays, and I think a lot of it is just getting used to the change that it is. Planting taller natives outside with the trees and shrubs can result in some additional screening. You know, I think that looks really lovely. This is pertaining to the solar developers, but also to the county people who are involved in conditional use permitting. So this is an ag fence, and we're all familiar with those. When you plant an ag fence, and when you install an ag fence and then plant natives on either side of it, that fence virtually disappears, and you don't see it. Remember in that earlier picture that I showed where that was the berm and the fence right next to the solar panels? That was a cyclone fence, and what I highly recommend is let go of the idea of a cyclone fence. We've created this beautiful critical habitat. Let's invite the game birds to be able to pass through. And what we've learned, here's a learning in Minnesota, is if you raise that ag fence up just 3 to 4 inches, game birds like pheasants and quail love to run through the grass. They'll go through the square openings, but they love to run underneath. We've seen box turtles go in and nest, and so raising it up just 3 to 4 inches, you've created this habitat. Let's invite the users of that habitat, which are the songbirds, the game birds, the small mammals. That same site, here's what we saw the following season. So permitting and ag land preservation. This is the permitting process. Getting your conditional use permit can sometimes go really smoothly. And then if you have neighbors that aren't welcoming the solar array there and it's a change that they weren't anticipating, it can be, as you know, a harder battle to win. One of the things that comes up in permitting is the whole concept of decommissioning. What happens at the end of the solar lifetime? Again, this is a really young industry. Think back, well, we don't know this, but you know, when cars were first out, as far as recycling, what happened to cars? We didn't really care, and we really still don't pay much attention to that. We just get our new car. The car recycling business, almost every part of the car is recycled now, and it's a $30 billion business just in the United States. I really believe that solar panels, the private enterprise will rise to meet this need, and that we'll be recycling solar panels. Right now it's done in pockets out on the East Coast. There's a recycler in Minnesota. The silver that are components, some of the rare minerals that are there, those components will be elements that we'll want to continue to recycle. So decommissioning won't be the challenge that we currently think it is, again, because it's such a young industry. I had one solar developer call and say, the Karner blue butterfly is present in this area, and I don't want you to plant any lupin on our solar site in case it gets listed as an endangered species. Well, it is an endangered species. And what they were afraid of is if they planted lupin, which is what the Karner blue butterfly caterpillar eats from, and it's the only plant that the Karner blue butterfly caterpillar will eat on, the only plant. So here we are creating pollinator habitat, but eliminating the specific plants and species that we want to have to try to help them survive. And so U.S. Fish and Wildlife has a safe harbor agreement that you as a private landowner can participate in providing habitat, critical habitat, and your safe harbor agreement allows you at the end of the time of the solar array to return that land back to farmland under the safe harbor agreement. Great concept, right? It really, it pulls out that whole issue of what I was describing with the Carner Blue. All of that information is on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife website, so you can read if you're a landowner wondering about that. Another thing that is the whole idea of supporting continued agriculture on solar is I was working with one of the early solar installers that had a pollinator-friendly site in Minnesota. And we were talking, and I said, well, since we're planting pollinators, let's invite someone who has bees on this site. Well, it happened to be a co-op, and they're always looking for electric co-op, which has members, and so they're always looking for ways to engage their members. So they had a beehive installation day and demonstrations throughout the summer. And then what's really cool is this co-op at the end of the season, what they invited every person who had subscribed to the solar array as a member to come at the end of August and pick up their free jar of solar honey. So people really got the idea that they were supporting not only solar and natives, but that marriage between the insect, the pollinators, and the forbs themselves. Most of us love honey in our food. What's even better? Honey in our beer. Solar Crush. This is the second year that Solar Crush, made with solar honey, is tapped at 56 Brewing in Minneapolis, and we just tapped it last week, and it's a great it's a great beer, and it's a great way to have that. You know, we have the pollinators, and we are inviting the insects in. There is always a discussion between, you know, honeybees are non-native, and we're providing forage for natives and non-natives. How's that working? That's part of what we're all learning, and that's why it's really important that we share information, you know, throughout this whole process, learning, you know, what's working for seeding under the solar panels, what's working with the insects, is having beehives chasing away native bees. And so that's where we really, this is a whole new world that we're in, and sharing that information is really important. So what do I see here? I see something that is harvesting the sun, and it is being productive, and to me, it's a row crop. It's an ag land that is being productive, but really what's important here too is the life of the array is usually 20 to more commonly 25 years, the land leases, all right? So the argument about land preservation, ag land preservation, I really, really believe that having solar arrays on ag land really helps preserve ag land, because you're not going to bring in a housing development. There's not going to be a quick trip that's going to go in here. For the next 25 years, it's locked down as ag land. And at the end of the 25 years, if it's not renewed as solar, that land is turned back to the landowner, and it's richer, better, healthier soil, and we've really accomplished a lot, including preserving ag land. And the slide that you just saw was planted in June of 2017, and this is roughly July, August of 2018. Isn't that great? So black-eyed Susans, just, you know, for solar developers, they're a fast, early, aggressive bloomer. It'll look like this for year 1 and 2. Then you may not see black-eyed Susans again, possibly ever, but everything else will come through and take over, the bergamots, the blazing star. This is why I don't mind seeing solar arrays. I think this is an amazing critical habitat, and it's a productive solar site. So those of us here, whether you're in planning commission or with the ag extension or a solar developer or a landowner, We are really we're at just an amazing time. We don't know what we don't know about how we are creating this beautiful patchwork quilt of not just solar, but critical habitat, starting at the Illinois border and lacing its way all the way up. And I really feel like we have this unique opportunity to create these 25-year legacies, and how many people in their work get to do that. And we do. And really, thanks again to environmental defenders for helping to make that happen in McHenry County. And if there's any questions, we still have a little time, right?
So, thank you so much, Colleen. So Colleen's willing to answer questions, and Nancy and Scott are going to circulate with the microphones, and I'm going to go out and get our next speaker lined up. So I'll leave it to the three of you.
Great. Somebody at least ask me about my coat so I don't feel bad, okay? Austin.
So, have you guys looked into establishing pollinators before the array's put in yet?
We tried that once really early on, and there's so much heavy equipment that is running over back and forth, that a lot of the expensive flower seeds left the site on the tire treads. So once and done. Yeah.
All right, I was at a meeting on Monday with Jordan Macknick, and he said that they're looking into trying to, like, 1 or 2 years before the site's put in to establish pollinators. So I don't know if you guys have looked into that or not yet either, I guess.
So I would say show me the solar developer that wants to pay land leases for 1 or 2 years without getting solar money off of it. I just don't think that's going to happen. Realistically, from a private business standpoint, the landowner may want to do that, but a solar developer is not going to want to invest in that money without knowing for sure that the solar array is going to happen. And too many things can go south, and they could not get their permit, and then there's a beautiful prairie restored. Yeah, I see that as just not, I'm an optimist, but I just don't see that happening.
Yeah, and I'll speak to that too. With the McHenry County Defenders proposed solar farm, we've been speaking to the McHenry County Conservation District, and they recommended waiting until after the arrays are put in as well. Just the amount of disturbance to the planted vegetation would be so great you'd be losing the capital that you invested. And so that seems to be a fairly consistent answer that we found as well.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions. The first is, have you worked on large utility scale solar also, or just the community solar?
Large scale as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you find, because when you're dealing with like 1,000-acre sites, do you find that there's a much more diverse seed mix that you're going to need for that because of the larger geographic area? Or is it pretty much the same over the whole site?
So we really believe that a seed mix should be spec'd for each site because soil conditions can change from one site to the next. Just like on the Bordeaux River, you have the east bank and the west bank, and apparently wine is quite different from either side. So we really, especially if you're looking at a 500 to 1,000 acre site, you're inevitably going to have upland areas and lower wetland areas, and so we would spec seed mixes unique to those locations.
Okay. And then my second question is, if you do have a site, ever worked with grazing on the sites?
Like with sheep?
Yeah.
So that is being done in California, and there are a couple of farmers that are doing it out on the East Coast, and there's one company that is doing a little bit of it in Minnesota.
Right.
In Illinois, is sheep grazing very common? This is not a setup, I'm just wondering, is it?
It's not super common, no.
Yeah, nor in Minnesota. We have, dairy cattle.
Right.
And so, first of all, you have having a farmer who has enough sheep that they want to graze to have it be effective. And then the array has to be large enough that you can fence off the sections of it. Sheep will eat it down, the plantings down really low. And if you've planted pollinators, you've just eliminated the chance for those pollinators to bloom and provide pollen and then go to seed. So the array has to be of a considerable acreage, 400 or 500 acres, to be able to fence it off and then move the sheep. Because we're all about natives, bison grazed on all of these natives, but they always moved along with their flow as far as their food sources. So from prairie restoration's perspective, we're not in that camp. I would say we'd be willing to hear about it, but we're just eating down the natives is a challenge.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate this
Thank you.
content. It's, I've been telling my colleagues that we're going to get 15,000 acres of solar farms in Illinois in the next 5 years. So
Awesome.
the tidal wave is about to hit us, and we are underprepared for this. But I'm a solar installer, so that's a good problem for me. Regarding bees, though,
Yeah.
I'm also an ecologist. I love honey and I love bees, but can you literally take a 20-acre solar farm and grow bees on that farm in a sea of corn and beans? Does that work in Illinois? Do you know?
And see it do, what was that last sentence? And
A
see
sea
it
of corn and beans. Illinois is a sea of corn and beans. There's not a lot of food for honeybees necessarily, except within the solar farm.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, does that really work? Can you take these postage stamp sized solar farms and turn them into bee farms? Does that work?
Absolutely. I was at there was like hundreds of gallons that come off of this, and it's really amazing because with natives, there's constantly a new flush of forbs coming. It's an amazing amount of honey. It's an amazing amount of honey that comes off of even a 10-acre array. Yeah, it works. And so in Minnesota, now we've seen a secondary industry pop up where there's people who have apiaries. That's their whole business. They have their hives, and they generally have a drive route, and they service those hives, and they might have 20 different sites, and they sell their honey, and that's their business. So it's really amazing. Was there another question?
So during the wind tower discussions in this area years ago, someone from the state had spoke about the underground wires heating up the soil just enough to impact like the turtle eggs, the gender, certain insects, stuff like that. Have you had any experience with that?
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you up here. If you could hold it closer to your mouth.
Years ago, someone from the state had presented that with like wind towers, the underground utility lines was heating up the soil enough to impact the gender of the turtle eggs and kill off some insects that were needed. Have you had any experience with the underground lines from the solar farms impacting anything?
You know what happens, that one picture that you saw with the junction box, those cables really go into a conduit and then they get buried so that there's less chance of anything. We see turtles nesting on the site all the time. Have I seen the turtles hatch? Haven't seen that, so that's part of the whole education. But they do run through conduits just like you have electricity running from buried electric poles to your house, running through conduit. Yeah.
When you were talking about the solar sites preserving farmland, it got me to thinking that, okay, in 25 years, who knows what the situation is going to be, the demand for property for development. So I was thinking that it would be a great idea if maybe we prioritized projects that permanently preserve the land for either a solar site or prairie or farmland in perpetuity, so that these projects that are willing to do this get priority over other projects. Have you ever heard of that happening anywhere, or what do you think about that idea?
It'd be awesome. It all comes down to money. But in 25 years, we don't know what we don't know. I'm guessing that our solar panels are just going to be so highly productive. Perhaps we need fewer of them, but we have this beautiful organic land, and that it can stay that way. So, yeah.
Hi. Has anybody tried to grow food, like an organic garden, under the solar panels?
Yeah, you know, not so much in Minnesota yet, though the Argonne Lab, they are testing when you, so in order for people to get under the arrays, they have to be raised pretty tall. They're doing it out in California. They're doing things like growing in the shade lettuces that love not being exposed to the sun all day. Agave plants are being planted out there. They're also trying bush beans that, again, don't want to be in the sun all day. And they're having great success with that. Minnesota climate, we have such a short season that I don't see that ever happening here other than maybe like pumpkins and squash.
If a solar array is built over an old landfill,
Yes.
what are the chances of the native plants being successful with the deep root system?
Yep, okay, so, and those are often called brownfields. That's a great opportunity that there's still, it's like the jury's still out on that, but here's one thing we know. A lot of times landfills, they're sealed with a membrane and then soil is put on top. The founder of Prairie Restorations, Ron Bowen, is, I'm such a fan of him because he's a walking encyclopedia. And he says what happens is the little blue stem that we showed that, there's this much above, those roots normally go really deep. When they hit that membrane, they go out. And he said, they adapt to it. It may not be ideal situation as far as like, they're not going to filter water because the water can't go through the membrane, but that is still, it's still possible. So that's a great use of that. Landfills, old abandoned gravel pits, that's another area too. There's full sun, nobody cares what it looks like down in there, so it can work. Yeah.
And then we'll load up to the next presentation.
Okay.
You can keep talking.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering, as far as maintenance goes, you just do mowing, you don't do prescribed burns at all through there?
That would be really tricky.
I thought so.
We don't.
Okay.
What you probably see is, here's what we do. When we see biomass, the beautiful thing about natives is, of course, they've evolved and that the stems that are there over winter become nesting material for overwintering for native insects. When we see too much of that build up, we will come through and do a mowing, but it's a mulching mow. And so we'll do that in the spring after we know those insects have hatched out. And that mulch now becomes fertilizer for that growing season. That's the closest thing to approximate a prairie burn, because the best thing would be a prairie burn, but we can't do that.
Colleen?
Yes.
I'll go next. I've just been wondering what you've been hearing for farmers as far as welcoming or not welcoming solar farms, and here's why I'm asking. I grew up on a farm in Iowa with an older brother who would have loved to have stayed on the farm and farmed with my dad, but there just wasn't enough cropland, not enough money for that. If my parents could have rented land to a solar developer and had steady income coming in from the rent from that solar farm, so my brother then would have been able to stay with them and have a family, everyone would have been ecstatic. And I just wonder if you're hearing this from farmers, or what are you hearing from farmers?
And that really is a great, especially we know being a farmer is really, really hard and it's not getting any easier. Being able to lease out your marginal farmland, not your wetland, but your marginal farmland, and have that be a constant check for the next 25 years, that's another legacy that you as a 85-year-old farmer are leaving for your kids and your grandkids, and it's a great thing.
This may have to be our last one. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. So you spoke a little bit about the utilization of scorecards and how it first started in Minnesota. Now Illinois also has a scorecard plan. I'm curious, in your experience on these larger sites, 500 to 1,000 acres, how effective have those sites been in implementing the scorecard? And have you seen achievement across the board as with those larger sites as you would with a 30-acre site?
I've seen greenwashing, and that means that the site gets planted sorta kinda in pollinator, and that's greenwashing when it's not really, you probably can guess how I feel about that. So incrementally, and I know one of the other speakers is going to talk about turf versus native, incrementally, when you look at how the millions that are installed, taken to install that array, the barely $1,000 difference in native seeds versus turfgrass times 25 years, what was missed there, merely because you decided as a developer to save $10,000 over a 1,000-acre array. Really, it's such a small infinitesimal amount of dollars compared to no substitutions. You've got to do it right. And really, we get one chance. Once that grass is put in, no one's going to pay to have it stripped out and have natives put back in.
And we have one last question right here. Jim?
I have two questions. One may not be for you, I'm not sure. But the first is, when it comes to growing underneath the panels, is the biggest problem the shade or is it water? Because I would think the water would be running off away from it.
Yes. You're not dressed like a biologist, so that's a...
It's something I've had in the back of my mind for a long time.
No, that's true. That's true. So that's where some of the fescues are more, they're really tough. They're a little more drought tolerant, and they're also more shade tolerant. So that is right. That does matter. Yeah.
Okay. And then, again, the next question, I'm not sure if it's appropriate or not, but for the farmers who lease this land out and who have been paying taxes on the basis of agriculture, are these projects then considered agriculture, or does something happen to them tax-wise and they become industrial?
In Minnesota, they're taxed as commercial. If there's a portion of it that is turned into, with the apiary on it, then there's consideration being allowed for ag land tax on that where there's beehives. But in Minnesota, it's taxed as commercial.
Thank you so much, Colleen. We so appreciate all this information.
Vince Mosca, who's the Vice President and Senior Ecologist at Hay and Associates, where he's been involved in thousands of wetland and ecological assessment projects over the past 30 years in northeastern Illinois and Wisconsin. Vince also regularly leads regulatory permitting efforts for both public and private sector projects, and he'll be talking with us today about preparing effective native planting specifications and requests for proposals for solar farms. So turning it over to you, Vince.
Good morning, everyone. I have two promises for you. This will be, the first promise is this will be the most boring presentation of the morning. And my second promise is I will try to make it more interesting. But I do find it interesting that we're talking about solar arrays and native vegetation, so that the original solar cell, the chloroplast on the green plants that make life on this planet possible, and then our new version of the solar cell, and that combination I find kind of interesting. So other people will be talking about the benefits of native vegetation and the plant selection and all those kind of more interesting things. I'm talking about people and contracts. So planting prairie isn't that hard, but it's not necessarily easy either. And so there's a human dynamic to this whole thing. So I'm going to try to bring some context to, especially for the solar developers in the crowd, and especially those that are coming from out of state and maybe doesn't really understand what prairie means or how to plant prairie, and then the implementation of some of that work. So one of the things is that, if you are coming from out of the region, you may have a design team that comes in. Sometimes, a convenience store, a car wash chain might bring in their crowd from Nebraska or Colorado to build, soup to nuts on a facility. But so if you have people coming in from out of state, they may or may not be familiar with where to buy seeds or what it takes, planting season, even those kinds of things that may not have in other parts of the country. So depending on how your crews are set up, it will be important on how you actually put out your work for bid, et cetera. And then also, one of the things about these projects is you might be able to build a solar array in a summer or a season, but the plant guy, the people that are actually doing the plant management in McHenry County will have to have a 5-year commitment to the property. So the concrete guys and the electricians and the grading contractors, they'll all be long gone, and the plant guy's stuck in Johnsburg for another 4.5 years. So that's something to be thinking about as you're putting your contracts together. So we're going to be talking about, contractor qualifications and some of the other standards that we're going to touch on today. Certainly the local protocols for where to buy your seed, local genotypes, all those kinds of things are very important. Depending on where your contractor's coming from, if they're local guys, there's quite a few good contractors in the upper Midwest to do prairies. But if they're coming in from out of state, they may have a little bit of a learning curve, at least how we do things. People plant seeds all over the place, not necessarily prairie, but there are some nuances to that they would have to become more familiar with. Obviously, there's some of the standard qualifications, similar experience, references, those kinds of things that people can put into their RFPs to make sure that you're getting the right contractor, not just that they're good landscape contractors, but that they actually understand some of the nuances of prairie planting. And then also some of the contractual things about having, good staff on site. So we've had projects, and I put a little note at the bottom that perennial rye is not the same thing as annual rye, because we've had multiple projects through the years where they'll say, okay, let's plant annual rye. The superintendent leaves, and the laborers pick a bag off the truck, and they plant perennial rye in areas they're not supposed to, and all of a sudden now you're chasing it for years. And as silly as that sounds, it's a really pain in the neck if the wrong seed gets into the ground, and so you have to make sure that who's on the ground and who's doing the work actually understands the difference between some of those things in the business. Construction season matters. You can't plant prairie all the time. Concrete guys have windows, grading contractors have windows, the plant guys have windows also. And so your timing and your sequencing of your project, it's important that they understand when they're going to be ready for seed, because they're going to say, all right, we're going to get tidied up by Thanksgiving. It's kind of late for prairie at that point. You can certainly do a dormant seeding, but if you need cover, erosion control, those kinds of things, us on the green side need a little bit more warmth and sunshine to do some of our work. So there's some of that stuff. I mean, some of that is actually construction related, but it needs to be planned for, because on our side of the business, we sometimes get forgotten about, if you will. And so all of a sudden everyone gets their work done and says, okay, put your seed down, and it's coming on Christmas, and even the annual rye or some of the cover crops aren't going to germinate at that point. So that's an important consideration for those kinds of things. Not that dormant seeding is a bad thing, and it's kind of what Mother Nature does, but at the same time, if you're going to have bare ground, erosion control blanket, all those kinds of things do help, but it's also nice to have that all knitted together and green as you're coming into the fall and winter. And there's some customary planting seasons around here, April, May, maybe into early June. And then on the backside, if you need to get the cover crop, you need at least, September, October for the annual rye to germinate. The natives probably won't germinate, or hopefully don't germinate in the fall, and will lay dormant for the winter, but you still need that time. You can't just say any time before hard frost, because annual rye, even though it germinates in a couple days sometimes, you need to give it that time to be able to germinate. The seed and plant sources, there's a lot of good nurseries around these days in the upper Midwest, and a lot of good guides on how to find them. The internet's perfect for doing some of those searches. The seed quality, pure live seed and all that stuff, which other people are going to talk about, but depending on how you set up your contracts, you may want to be able to see the seed before your guys put it down. If you have your own crews, maybe you trust them. If you're hiring somebody from the street, so to speak, you may want to be able to see the seed before it goes down to make sure that you're getting what you paid for. Some of the ratios and the seed mixes, which will be talked about by other folks, and also a certain amount of seed. You don't necessarily want to overseed some of these sites, but you don't want to have not enough seed that you don't have good cover. And then as a part of the contract, depending on who you've hired, you may want to have that materials inspection so that the day of the planting, you're able to see what is in those bags, and maybe even before the seed is actually mixed, you want to be able to see the bags with the names on it to make sure that you've gotten the right stuff. Vegetation height, which was obviously talked about a little bit, and we'll be talking about some more. There's some, ratios of that, but as you put your specifications together, you have to be cognizant of that, because some of our wonderful prairie plants, plant people in the crowd, a cup plant, which can be 7 or 8 feet tall and about 5 feet in diameter. It's probably not appropriate for here. Wonderful pollinator plant, but obviously would be a bad plant, so to speak, on this project. So also, depending on the touch of the contractors on the rest of the site, these are a lot of the black soil sites around here for these the solar arrays, but soil compaction above and beyond agricultural compaction is an important consideration. These are obviously a little bit less intense grading-wise compared to some other land uses, but it is still something that you want to be aware of. And then the rain and sun shadows consideration. McHenry County is developing some standards for the solar array, the plantings, and the performance standards. So we don't have them yet, but they are coming. And so as they are developed, you're going to want to make sure that in your request for proposals and in your performance standards that the county's regulations and standards will be incorporated in there. We expect that the county is going to go more of a coverage and functional base rather than a total diversity base from a planting standpoint, just to kind of keep it as a reasonable standard, but obviously any developer can go a little above and beyond that as necessary. But a good prairie is probably as important as a great prairie in these circumstances. So we don't expect that the county is going to go over the top, sort of like a wetland mitigation standard or something like that with all the full statistics, but that a good pollinator garden will suffice as adequate habitat. And there'll be some of the percent covers and those kinds of things, as opposed to full biodiversity and transects and all the things that go into that. Depending on the touch and the amount of disturbance on a solar farm, in an NPDES permit, over an acre disturbance, those kinds of things will potentially come into play. So as you're developing your planting specifications and your RFPs, you want to make sure that those contractors are aware of your NPDES requirements so that you can get out of your permit requirements as soon as possible with the cover. Soil type considerations on the types of seed that if you do have black soil versus gravel versus a little wetter soils, all those kinds of things will matter. Slope and grade, as we saw in the previous presentation on some of that. This is obviously not a solar farm here, but you get the impression of the need to get things stabilized. And then also for erosion control blanket and silt fence are standard. The TRMs or turf reinforcement mats, nice products. They don't play well with prairie. So as your developers and your engineers are putting your plans together, turf reinforcement mat, unless you need it for erosion control, the density and the thickness of the blanket tends to be very restrictive to the bigger leaves of our native plants as opposed to a turf. And so they tend to suppress the development of the prairie. So you want to be judicious in your use of the TRMs as you're moving forward. Also, the one thing about the contracts is that it's very important for a developer to have their contractor tied to performance. So to have somebody come in and plant and leave, so to speak, is not going to cut it here, partially because it's one thing that you might not get what you paid for or need to have, but also McHenry County is going to expect a 5-year commitment. So you want to make sure that your contractor is aware of that. And then there are the fox guarding the hen house kind of issues, so that if you have your planting contractor doing your management and your monitoring, sometimes those monitoring reports can be a little glowing about how well things are doing. Sometimes you want a third party to come in and actually do it, just simulations or whatever. You won't necessarily want your concrete contractor doing all the quality control testing. So no insinuation at all that anyone would cheat. However, you want to make sure that you're getting what you paid for. And we do management and monitoring and reporting ourselves. And, but at the same time, if you're not familiar with a certain contractor, first time you worked with them, sometimes a third party might help with that. And then that would be then submitted to the county. So the county will be expecting a 5-year grow-in period through performance. And so from that standpoint, you will need somebody that will be there for the long haul in one way, one form or another. And it might not be a bad idea to have a letter of credit or a performance bond or an escrow. The county may have a requirement for that as a part of that. So as you would go, you would draw that down as your performance comes through. So it goes without saying, you need to hire competent planting contractors, but also that it would be our recommendation that your contractor has skin in the game, in that if, with like something like a performance bond or retainage, so that they have an incentive to come back, so that if you pay them all of their money by year 2, even though they're under contract for years 3, 4, and 5, sometimes it's hard to incentivize a contractor to come back if there's no money left in their contract or, any reason to come back. So if you do have crews coming in from out of town, the initial plantings can be done by one party and the follow-up work can be done by another. You just have to make sure that you plan for that in your contracts, because if you do come in from out of state, that planting contractor is very likely not going to want to come back here in June, July, and August every year to do work out there. So you can get your local contractors to do some of that. You just have to be aware of that as you move forward. So I open it up for questions and comments. Any experiences people have had?
Vince, it was good that you included the reference to the Chicago Wilderness Native Plant Guide.
Yes.
Our native plant, I guess, restoration and guidelines. I just want to point out within that there are guidelines for selecting contractors, like how do you pick a contractor? I think there's even a list of maybe qualified contractors. And so I know you guys are part of that. HUSA was part of that. I think AES and others were part of that.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is I just want to kind of get a little bit more into depth. In terms of the performance criteria, you will have performance criteria like success of the native plantings as well as control of invasives, similar to some of the existing guidelines like the Chicago Wilderness Guidelines?
Yes.
Okay.
But I didn't touch on that too much directly here because I believe that one of the other speakers is going into that more detail. But any of the RFPs that would have the management monitoring in there should have top-loaded what the expectations is through the growing period.
Okay, just a real quick follow-up. Beyond the initial planting or in the 5-year performance window, there will be a requirement that the landowner maintains that site through the duration of the project, so for 25 years typically.
Yes, I think there's probably 2 periods that are important. McHenry County will expect to grow in for performance and documentation for 5 years. The site will be maintained for 25 years. So that the formal management and monitoring, especially the monitoring and reporting, might end after year 5, but the management obligation will continue.
Yeah, just we don't have it completely written out yet, but we do expect that there will be requirement to maintain it throughout the life of the project, through decommissioning. So it's not just 5 years and forget it. There will be long-term requirements on top of that.
Just quickly, I'm wondering about fire. Nobody's addressed that yet. In terms of accidental fires, it seems like some of these, there's been no design, nobody's put up any seedless or mixed designs yet, but I would be really concerned about areas that consist of a lot of little blue stem and side oats. Just a chance of a spark getting away or another fire getting over there, the damage that would cause. And then just, again, seed mixes. Nobody's put any examples up yet. I have questions about those. Okay.
I don't have any personal experience of fires on a solar array. I can't imagine it's necessarily good for any of the exposed wiring. The panels might be fine since they're relatively out of the flames, but flames can be obviously 10 feet tall even with short stuff, let alone the taller vegetation. But I think there's going to be another speaker on some of the maintenance issues related to there. And then I think they're also going to have seed mix discussions, which I did not touch on directly.
Yes, we have an entire other speaker that will be speaking about seed selection and so forth. And just speaking as a person who has helped with a lot of prairie burns over the years, I know we have heard from people in the past saying, oh my goodness, if there's a prairie outside my house, it's, you know, near my house, it's dangerous, that prairie could catch on fire. You know what? We have the hardest time sometimes getting a prairie to burn. So I just want to put your mind at rest. Sometimes you really have to work at it, right? So don't worry about that. And does anyone, Colleen, did you want to mention anything about, have there ever been solar farms that have sparked a fire? Do you have any idea?
Right. We haven't, that's something that I watch for all the time, and I read like a nerd. I read all these, you know, really fascinating solar e-newsletters every day. I haven't seen that happen, and that is part of the whole management, is when the biomass gets tall, is to do that spring mulch and have it become fertilizer. And to date, we haven't seen that happen, and there's not a lot of sparking that, the one time the spark did occur was when they were actually installing the wires to an inverter, and that was the only time. That was during installation, and there was just bare dirt.
Hi, I noticed on your calendar that you had the planting schedules.
Yes.
For the time of year, you had applications for herbicides. You had it in two different sections. Is there a way of avoiding that with your planting to minimize the risk of using products like Roundout and things like that?
Is there a way to avoid
using herbicides with your planting?
At all?
At all.
Well, an easy answer is yes, just don't use them. And that's where the mowing comes in, you know, some of during the growing period. And there's, you know, weed whacking and hand pulling and all those kinds of things. However, when all's said and done, things like Canada thistle or the new scourge around here, teasel, and when they come in, essentially herbicide, you know, spot spraying is almost about the only way to do it, especially on a larger scale. So, and I don't want to say that herbicides are inevitable, but they're almost inevitable, quite honestly, on some of that, especially for the perennial weeds. You know, mowing and, you know, even some hand pulling and those kinds of things are okay, but when it comes down to some of these perennial weeds, it just, it's the nature of the beast these days, unfortunately. So it's still, you know, judicious use and, you know, broadleaf versus, you know, Roundup or grass selective, depending on what you're using. And it's usually backpack type spraying as opposed to wholesale spraying.
So is that something that you do annually, or is it like the initial planting, you have to do it to get the initial plants established and then you're good? But is it part of your 20-year annual maintenance plan?
Probably not. I mean, during that establishment period, the first 2 or 3 years, that big flush, you know, these are all ag sites. Ironically, maybe the Roundup has been in some ways good for weeds because it kills everything. And so we have less weeds in the fields than we had 25 years ago because of the Roundup Ready corn and beans. Now they use the spray, the Roundup, that kills essentially everything, including good plants like monarch milkweeds and those kinds of things. So, you know, but that flush of things like the annual weeds, we don't worry about too much because mowing's great for that. But it's those Canada thistles and the teasels and perennials and biennials, the non-native thistles that we, you know, once you get those established, you get good cover. And the native prairie does do well, but I can't say that you won't need herbicide at some point in the future, but it's certainly much, much less than it would be on a young prairie.
And to further negate that idea of herbicide use, if these solar farms, if they're put on farmland, if the farmland was retained there and the solar farm was not placed there, that farmland would have, sadly, quite a bit of herbicide put on it over several times during the year. Whereas the solar farms, there will be spot weeding that will need to be done, and who knows, maybe there'll be a shrub or two that would come in up in the solar farm. If that happens,
the maintenance person would cut that shrub, and there wouldn't be spraying of the herbicide. Instead, it would be take a paintbrush. Maybe some of you have done this or seen this before. You just take a paintbrush and you just paint the herbicide on that stem only. So there's not a spray of herbicide going into the air as a result. So I think the herbicide use will be much, much lower.
And I would say that that also goes to having a good, solid contractor, good seeds, enough seeds to get that cover so that you're helping using, natural competition to help keep those weeds down. So that if you had not very much seed, not a good contractor, you're going to be chasing weeds a lot longer than the opposite.
And Vince, I know that one thing that all of us in the county are very concerned about, we want to make sure that these solar farms end up looking like the solar farms that Colleen showed in her photos. We don't want weeds developed in these on these solar farms. So is there if people in the audience were to go to your website, do you actually have examples of requests for proposals that they could look at to develop their own requests for proposals to include things like making sure that maintenance is kept up over time and so forth?
We wouldn't have that on our webpage. I mean, there's a bunch of public documents that, like McHenry County Conservation District or the Lake County Forest Preserve, they put out requests for proposals for different plantings. There'd be a lot of that. Dennis mentioned the Chicago Wilderness, the picture I had up there. They do have some guidelines on picking contractors and those kinds of things in there, but we wouldn't have anything necessarily on our webpage. But there's quite a bit out there these days on how to set up this sort of, they call it the special provisions for contracts, that people could get some pretty good ideas.
Okay. You move out here with this, and we're going to set up the next proposal.
Any last question then?
Vince can keep answering questions. We're just going to get the next presentation set up.
Any solar developer that heard something that you want to comment on or get clarification on? We do have one comment over here. Kim Kolner from McHenry County Planning and Development Department.
Thank you. I just want to make a quick statement to answer some of the questions from before in regards. I used to know it off the top of my head, and thankfully all the solar applications were approved by the county in January, so I haven't had that in my mind. So I looked up real quickly. It's going to be assessed by the state, so this is state legislation, at $218,000 per megawatt. Most of the applications that have come through the county are between 2 and 4 megawatts. 4 is going to kind of be their max for a co-locate by state statute. This can power approximately 250 to 300 homes. As a part of the community solar program, the state is allotted 117 megawatts through the block grant program to community solar. They've received applications for over 800 megawatts. So there's going to be quite a few that will not be selected in this first round. We are under the understanding that they might be doing up to 4 rounds. Beyond that, I don't know. The first round lottery will be chosen on April 10th. So just next week, we'll know which applications within the county have been selected and start the permitting process. For unincorporated McHenry County, we've had 31 applications, 2 withdrawn, 4 denied, so 25 have been approved through McHenry County, plus many more in municipal limits. Those include a 100 megawatt utility scale project in Marengo, as well as proposals on all 3 campuses of the Huntley High School, or of the Huntley School District, as well as the Lake in the Hills Airport, among many more. A breakdown, I did a quick case study for the taxes. If on a 16-acre solar project, which would be about 2 megawatts, at a tax rate of 9.6, the taxes would be approximately $13,950. The current taxes on that exact same site right now are $5,200. This is clearly not going to be the same along all of the solar projects that get developed because tax rates change from township to township, and the current taxes may be assessed differently depending on other improvements on those sites. So just a general idea of kind of the things going on right now in McHenry County.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks so much to Vince. We so appreciate this.
Thank you, Vince. That's a very important topic, and you weren't boring at all. Our next speaker is Jack Pizzo, and I think he's going to answer a lot of the questions that people have been asking of some of our other speakers. Jack is the president of the Pizzo Group. He's also a landscape architect, a horticulturist, and ecologist with both his degrees from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He founded the Pizzo Group in 1988, and since that time his company has consulted, designed, supplied, built, restored, and managed water and ecosystem projects for public and private clients throughout the country. Today, Jack will be providing information on seed and plant selection, as well as site preparation and installation of natives on solar farms. So, welcome, Jack.
Well, thank you. It's good to be back. I remember coming here years ago and standing in front of a group, and it was just to talk about natural areas and restoration. And now this is seeing a crowd about the same size, but focused purely on solar farms, means that we have progressed. I mean, 30 years ago when I started the business, all of us could have probably sat around a kitchen table. So we have come a long way. Thanks, Vince, for the proposal and or the presentation, and Colleen, because they brought up some really good points. This isn't easy, and it's a challenge to do it, and you're going to be working, trying to put something back. Sometimes, let's say, putting 10 pounds of stuff into a 5-gallon sack, and this is. I'm never the cheerleader, but I'm also a big fan of this, because this is not easy work to do. So we are 4 companies. We're design and design and consulting, landscape architecture. Let's get this. Okay, work with me. There we go. Okay, and the nursery company as well. Pizzo and Associates does the work. Native Landscape Contractors does the work, well, except that Native Landscape Contractors is a union company. So we can work on any job site that requires labor agreements. So we'll work right alongside your general contractors and everything, and be able to work with them without incident, which can be a problem in Illinois. We've also won 148 awards, which the point is that we put our work out in front of our peers, and they judge it award-winning. And that's not just because it looks good, because it's functional too, as well as makes habitat for humans. So we're working on pollinator habitat, right? Well, you buy one and you get all those free. So you're putting in, you're taking care of human health. People drive by this stuff and they go, their blood pressure drops. You get the solar worker goes out there, he gets to work in nature all day while he's working on a solar farm. That's a real benefit. So there's all those things, including stormwater management, biodiversity. So it's a real mix that you end up, if you solve one problem, you solve many. And it's, everybody wants to think it's all rainbows and happiness, and I kind of fancy myself a photographer. I took this at my house. But you realize that there is a storm that comes before that rainbow. And we are in that time where we're trying to fit a ecosystem restoration under a photovoltaic system. I've seen a lot of hype, but I keep seeing the same pictures. So this really is truly young. That we're talking about putting the vegetation under there, but if you look at the systems that are out there, there's very few that have tried natives. And what I'll tell you again is that it isn't that easy, and that education's the key. So as Vince pointed out, you have to have that contract in place, and you have to educate the neighbors. You have to educate the owner of the property. You have to educate the solar farm. The solar company. And that good design, that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So like Vince said, with the fescue bag on the back of the truck, if you inspect that seed and you read those labels, boy, chasing that fescue out of that site is a nightmare if that gets planted. But if you actually go in and make sure that those plants and seeds get inspected before then, you can make sure that that doesn't happen. But good design leads to easier maintenance and better performance. Because if you don't take care of invasive species, this is what happens. There's a reason they're called invasive species. And you don't have to play nice with them. Don't get all kumbaya on me and go, I don't want to use herbicides. Keep that tool in my toolbox. Because my goal is to get to no herbicide use. Really is. And it can happen. But I can't against that plant. Or let me put it this way. You don't have enough money in your budget to pay me to pick each and every one of those plants, which that's what it would take if you take herbicide out. Or Phragmites. You let that get established. That's not a toy. That is an actual full-size skid steer in 18-foot Phragmites. So don't let that stuff get established. The ounce of prevention is worth the pound of cure. And if you don't do the maintenance, these are what the sites look like. This is Grand Ridge Solar down in LaSalle. We went by it. It was planted 12 years ago, had looked like a good mix, but it's basically defaulted to fescue. And that's, hey, it's better than exposed soil on a farmland, but it's something that we, would prefer that there be diversity there. So people ask, aren't flowers flowers? No. And I'm also going to admit, every picture of a solar farm or anything I clipped from the web. So if I took it off your website, solar companies, or I offend you, I apologize. Because I didn't credit you right here. And that's Wikipedia. But it's about the birds and the bees. Everybody's talking about pollinators. These are the hives at my house. I believe a gentleman over here asked about honey and hives and being in the middle of corn and beans. It works. My home is in the middle of 38,000 acres of corn and beans, and I have beehives on 40 acres of prairie, and I think the last harvest they did was 70 pounds of honey. So it works. But it's also about the birds. You create that habitat and put them together, but it's really about the birds and the bees because it's about sex, right? Sex sells, right? How do you tell the difference between a male monarch and a female monarch? Huh? The dot, right? Well, you can barely see it right there. Also color. Females are darker orange, males are lighter orange. But that's a whole lot of loving going on in that picture. Now, we're all here because of sex, right? And this has, your parents should have come from different gene pools. And if they didn't, I don't want to know. But that means you're genetically unique. Just like every seed that's produced in every plant, genetic resilience leads to resiliency of the ecosystem. That is why we use genetically or sexually produced plants in there. And so sex leads to an egg, to a caterpillar, to a chrysalis, and that whole cycle is going on, and an adult only lives for 2 to 6 weeks. I mean, we're talking about pollinator habitat. We're talking at making sure things are around for those plants, those insects when they need it. So that's why the length of the flowering season is important to have that. Because they're moving up now. They started in Mexico and they head right up, and they're gonna have generation after generation after generation produced, and that eventually getting back to Mexico. But in each and every one of those pods, this is just after the burn yesterday, the seed head, the stem fell down, and every one of those seeds is genetically unique, just like us. So that gets a little drier, gets a little wetter, gets a little shadier. There's genetic diversity in there to allow that adaptation to that site. And so here, the iris seeds right on the wetland, ready to go, sunlight. But every one of your landscape plants, I would say almost exclusively every one of your landscape plants is produced without sex, which is a fancy way of saying cloning. So every one of your landscape plants is genetically identical. What do you think happens when the sites change on or the conditions change on those sites? Now people are saying pollinators, pollinators, we want them, we want to have them. This is why it's important. 1998, Cook County Forest Preserve, I was out with Jerry Sullivan, the ecologist, and he said, kid, document this. Lived and fed something, and it feeds things like caterpillars. Here's a black walnut, same day, downy hawthorn, same day feeding something. So why this is important to have native plants around? Because look at the species like goldenrod. They feed 115 species of just lepidopterans. This is why plant selection is important. Or the oaks that feed 534 species. That's just the moths and butterflies. That's not any other order of insects. And they do less than 5% damage. And yet people will accept 10% damage. And that's because the birds are eating them. So here's 5% damage. And look, I mean, I was being an artist, I was cutting a leaf up. And you can see that really there isn't much damage done by native insects. But this is what happens when you get non-native plants in there, is that nothing eats them. And here was the city of Maplewood in Minnesota who said, look at our beautiful native trees, and there's not a hole in that leaf. And that's really uncommon, thinking like, oh, what are they doing such that there are no insects feeding on these red oaks? But look, Phragmites in its native range, 170 species feed on it. Here, only 5 species. It's been in the US over 300 years. Or purple loosestrife, and causing decreased seed production out in wetlands because its pollen lands on the native plants and they stop reproduction. Or that purple loosestrife in the wetland is pollinated 90%, better than 90% with the European honeybee, whereas the native plant blooming at the same time is only pollinated 2.4%. So you can see, European plant, European insect. And if you do that, this is 248 species of insects that can have habitat with just 3 plants. And if you think that using horticultural varieties, because you're going to get, that might say this might be acceptable on a project, well, that's Hydrangea Arborescens, that's the horticultural variety. And here's the difference in pollinators on that when they're in bloom. Notice no pollinators on Annabelle, and we come around here, and that's the species right next to it. Dramatic difference in horticultural varieties. How do I know that? That's my patio. I practice what I preach. So getting another horticultural variety, that's a whole lot more nothing to a pollinator. But you can see the native plants really do provide habitat. And it's out on a former bean field. Even the lowly silver maple provides that habitat. But look at the interesting things that where these insects live. So you have the 2 species of wasp that forms that little capsule, or an ichneumon wasp, or a caterpillar that eats an oak leaf, or a stem miner that gets into one of our beautiful cone flowers, but that's equally as beautiful as the flower. Or the helgramites that are in the wetland that turn into the dragonflies that fly there and eat the insects in the air. Or when everybody moans about the cicadas that come up and give us our free soil aeration. And you'll never win a staring contest with a cicada. I didn't, I blinked. And all those things that are out there in your landscape, and the flies that are out there. Way back here, like everybody's moaning about locust bugs. Locust bugs in the landscape are good because they feed other things. And we try to get people to understand this, so this is going to be about creating information that we go out to the neighbors and to the regulators. If they don't want to deal with all that craziness of this kind of an ecosystem drawing, then this is easy. Or here, this is Delta's map of their hubs in the United States. This is easy enough to say, look, this is what the plants are and the insects are moving back and forth between them. Notice down here, there's no plant or insects going to our non-native plants. It's easy to communicate this to people. But I want you to understand, make no mistake, this is about us. And this is about solar electricity, this is about sustainability, because Mother Nature loves all the weeds and the natives just the same. Notice she didn't stop buckthorn or Phragmites from growing here. It's about us. We need those pollinators because it's upwards of $20 billion a year in value that pollinate our food crops. But if you also, right, solar people, right? Solar panels perform better at cooler temperatures. So if you look at asphalt on a 10 o'clock on a summer day, it's 102. Turf grass mowed underneath a solar panel, for example, 85 degrees. That prairie is 69 degrees. That's because those roots are pulling up that water and evaporating it. That helps your system. Look at what we're doing here. So if we're doing restoration only of habitats, that's what it would look like in a suburban area. If we go into the open space areas, the retention systems, we could do that. But if we put native plants back in the landscape, that's how much of the picture we could actually impact. But imagine if we had solar farms and started filling those out with habitat. We would have the trifecta. This would become like a national park that you don't have to drive too far to go to. You get to see Mother Nature, and if you want to go see Yellowstone, it's a different kind of nature. So people have asked, in this, like, well, how are you going to present this? And I said, well, really what we're trying to create is more like an oak savanna without the fire. Because we've got the cover, and the sun moves up, in the sky, or the earth moves, sun stays still. And maybe these panels move, maybe they don't, but you're just trying to get a certain amount of light down to the ground so that there is enough light to cover, to allow those plants to grow. And we have examples out there, which are oak savannas. Now kind of comes the boring part, where in this plant selection, the primary thing is, this is about the maintenance of a solar facility, and the establishment and maintenance of it. This is not about kumbaya. This is not about pollinators. This wouldn't be there if there wasn't a solar facility. So we have to make sure that as we're looking at this, we're always looking at the success of the solar facility, and if we have to go to one less species or something like that, we can do that and not and work with the facility rather than going with, oh, we have to have that diversity. Like I think Vince mentioned with, looking at a lower diversity, more of a coverage. We do want to stick with native. Why do you want to stick with native? Because these plants evolved here. Everybody's like, well, we can get this and it's improved and it's new. Well, just think about it. Since the last glaciers wiped this place clean, these plants have evolved here. This is why we stick with locally native plants. They know this ecosystem. They know it snows in April. I was reviewing pictures for the presentation last night. I have pictures of frost on May 22nd. You don't have to worry about that affecting the plant. And the next thing would be the height. Now, when I say that height, I'm not only talking about the height of it right now and the height that everybody says, oh, this is only 2 feet tall. I'm talking about the height if you get a really wet year and a lot of lightning drops a lot of nitrogen on those plants, and then they go whoosh, and they start growing. So that's the kind of height, ultimate height, that you would have to deal with. And aesthetics. So we get, people will say, well, we want it to look pretty. Well, if you're looking at pollinators, you have that flush of flowers in the spring, you have your summer flowers, and then you have your fall flowers. So working for pollinator habitat actually makes it pretty. So people sometimes criticize what we do as, you're working more on aesthetics. I'm like, Mother Nature's beautiful. I don't mind working on aesthetics, because if I put it all together, it's going to be beautiful, but it's going to be diverse. Allopathy, we have to worry about. When he said fescues, you have to worry about that, because those plants have underground chemical warfare. You all probably heard of black walnuts. Things can't grow under black walnuts. Well, they secrete a chemical that stops other plants from growing. So you do not want to use chemical or plants like the cereal rise, almost any of the fescues, unless you absolutely have to, because they'll stay established and they secrete chemicals and they stop other things from growing. That's why they're ideal lawn grasses, because they battle underneath the ground to keep other things growing. So you can't let them in. The density of the seeding. I was talking with one of the suppliers, and he mentioned that Solar Ridge planting down in LaSalle County, and his specification had 127 seeds per square foot. That's a good mix. That's what you need. You can't get away with 8, 9, 10 seeds per square foot. 200 seeds per square foot would be even better. It's never, you really can't seed too heavily. And I say that knowing that you could. If you wanted to dump 1,000 pounds per acre, that would be killer. You'd probably have overkill. But more so within budget, you can't seed too heavy because there are 1 million weed seeds per square foot. And if you don't start to outcompete them, you will never win the battle. So that density is important. And then pure live seed. So you're taking the seed, and you can, probably the best person to answer that is Bill. Raise your hand, Bill. Bill can talk about the quality of seed, but understanding that what you're getting is live seed, not just raw seed, that it's been tested. We want to make sure that you have the amount of live seed you need to get an establishment of that species. Vince mentioned inspections. We totally agree, and we're working with Vince on a project up at Pine Dunes Forest Preserve, and just having everything inspected beforehand, and again, even before it's mixed, to make sure that you have the right species in the right quantities before it gets mixed together and before it gets installed. Because once it's in the ground, you ain't gonna be able to count it. Because, it's gotta go in and those seeds disappear very quickly amongst dirt. Also availability. The one thing that I would say that, there many people in the room have dealt with, which is, the love of Mother Nature, and they want to get things in. But I can tell you, Commandra umbellata seed is just not available. I don't care if you design it in and you want 1,000 pounds of it, nobody will be able to grow 1,000 pounds of that plant. Or in a recent specification not too long ago, somebody wanted 5 pounds of orchid seed. And if anybody knows about orchid seed, I don't think there's 5 pounds of orchid seed in the world. I mean, that's how, it's tiny, it's dust-like. It's a naked embryo, basically. So making sure that when the specifications are designed, it's reaching out to the suppliers and understanding that if, in the case of a solar farm, would be to go to the suppliers and pre-buy their inventory. Same thing with the plugs, is go there, work with them so that you guarantee that you will have it when you need it, and not go and just put it out there and say, okay, well, here's September 1. That's going to be a scramble to get what you need or what's in the specification. So availability is important. And if you've got the time, if it's 2, 3, 4 years in the planning, working with a supplier to make sure that you have the seeds available or the plants available. The methods of installation are important because native seed needs to go in, that deep, right? You got to till the soil, and then you furrows, you drop it in and you cover it up, right? No, native seed goes in that deep. And if you put it in too deep, you've just planted a whole bunch of expensive organic matter. And so you have to make sure that that site is properly fine graded after the installation is done, so that, and I'm looking at this because we've been planted under a solar array, but that's more than likely going to be spread by a drop seeder or a rotary seeder. And you're not going to be driving a big Truax drill through there. Maybe on the outside, but not on the inside. So you're going to have to make sure that you've got clean seed that can be able to be dispersed, but that seed bed is ready to accept those seeds. And you might not even get the chance to rake them in. It may be that you're planting at a point that they get worked in on their own. And also in doing this, all too often we get people designing stuff that we see with high diversity in a small area. And you know what happens? It ultimately defaults to 1 or 2 species. So when it comes to these smaller areas, let's not get too aggressive in writing the county ordinances, but also in the specifications for the property, that you end up putting 30 species in a small 10-foot wide strip that's 50 feet long. You may not get that establishment. You could never meet the performance criteria because the conditions aren't right for a particular species. So in smaller areas, reduce the diversity, but increase the you'll increase the establishment. And then when you're working with the design of these sites, you'll have the perimeters or retention areas or areas that are not part of the active solar array. And then you'll have, you know, the areas down along the roadways and then areas underneath the solar panels. And people asked about fire. Well, in Mother Nature, we know that maintaining a healthy diversity, you need a 3-year rotation of fire. Well, we're not going to burn. That's for sure. But if you have an area that's outside of that that gets actively managed with fire, and then you have, you know, some areas that aren't burned in a year, and then you have areas that never get burned, you'll have what are called fire positive, fire neutral, and fire negative insect species habitat available. Because there are some species that don't like fire at all, and there are some species that thrive with fire. So that way you actually can create that kind of habitat that we need without having to worry about, you know, burning an area that has a fire negative species in it. So as you go through that, the maintenance of a facility, that's the one thing that we have to worry about, is that those rows between those arrays, that's a roadway. It might be a 2-track roadway, but that's a roadway. And driving over top of plants like that compacts the soil and can kill them. So putting a heck of a lot of diversity, a heck of a lot of expensive seed in between the 2 panels is something that, you know, as they need to get in there to wash them, to clean them, to knock snow off them, or plow to get in there and plow the snow out of the way so you can knock the snow off of them. She mentioned raising Colleen, you mentioned raising the height of the panels, because vegetation stops the wind. And when you stop the wind, snowflakes settle out. So you can see it out on prairies, they will capture all that snow. Therefore, a mowing prior to winter might help knock some of that down so the air keeps moving, but you still have to realize that they're going to have to get in with vehicles to do all of that. So you can't have this incredibly amazing diverse prairie with all sorts of you know, specific and delicate plants under where the ATVs and the pickup trucks roll. Because that's about the weight of a car and its PSI. You know, I have beehives at my house, but I'm telling you, I don't like being stung by bees, and I'm not allergic. But if the hives are too close to where the solar employees are working, that could be a challenge if somebody has an allergic reaction. So it's making sure that there's a little bit of distance, because the bees will fly, trust me. But what's interesting is that you're creating habitat for all sorts of things. Another picture I clipped off the web. I was like, any place that is protected, the wasps will build nests. So you have to be conscious that that's part of what we're creating is habitat. But one of the other things that I was thinking about in long term, you're talking a 25-year site. I mean, I can't even be guaranteed my house will be around in 25 years. But there will be the solar array because it's been set up with all of the contractual issues. But if there's an area that gets disturbed, you will need to have a maintenance mixture in there. If there's an area that gets completely disturbed during construction, so a couple of minor tire ruts need to be fixed, that's this mixture. But if there is something, if you have a damage done, a solar panel, hailstorm, and they need to get in and fix it, and you need to cover that soil so it doesn't erode, you better have a maintenance mixture listed in there, and it might be a spring mix and a fall mix because of the different types of things that will cover the ground and stop it from eroding. And then you're going to have a temporary mix. It might be something you'll just put out there in July to cover the site to protect the soil from eroding until you can get in there in August or September and do the final seeding. So these are all things that need to be planned out. And then those, as Vince mentioned, the erosion control. that just making sure that, that it's available, especially if you're getting into a disturbance that happens on site, whether that's erosion control blanket or silt fence, to protect that area during its establishment. This is something that I heard many years ago, but it's just simply, geology dictates hydrology. The way the land was laid down dictates the way the water moves on it, and that hydrology dictates the ecology of the site. So if it's all sloped facing south and drains really quick, you can better believe that it's going to be a hot, dry ecosystem that goes out there. And this is not one size fits all. It is very site specific. Somebody asked the question about 1,000 acres. You can better believe there might even be 1,000 different seed mixes that go out there. But that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Spend time putting those together and you will better set yourself up for success. And that everything is local. And that you may have to be dealing with local issues that, the wet and the dry. So high dry part of a site, a low wet, or a wet year. I mean, I've seen some sites that when the rain came, like last year, we saw plants grow to 12 feet tall that we would never thought got above 6 feet. They just took off in all that rain and humidity. So you have to be conscious of that. The soil types you're going to need to know. The rocky soils you mentioned, mowers hitting rocks. In some of these areas, you cannot get away from rocks. You couldn't even clear all the rocks because the first frost will push a whole bunch more up. And that ends up being that, you just have to deal with that. That means you have to adjust the kind of mowers you use. We just got into a contract with a place in Chicago that they're replacing all the mowed grass because the contractor has broken the last of the windows that cost $30,000 each to replace. So they're putting back in native plants so they don't have to mow anymore. See, saves money. The size of the planting areas, again, like the species in there, the size of the site, you may want to be able, you can create different habitats, 2 different types of plantings on 2 different dry sites. The topography, how it goes down. I can tell you, you might go out there and break drain tiles or you might install drain tiles, but you don't know exactly how the hydrology is going to work until you've seen the site, in place. So the planting zones are, going to vary a little bit. So that's where these mixes have to have some crossover when you're laying them out. Obviously, your county and city regulations, the sun, the shade, but also I want you to be fire-wise. Bill mentioned fire. It's not something you want on a solar farm. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But you can see when they build them, they beat up the soil. So as you're laying out the specifications for the contractor, make sure that minimal soil compaction, and if they do heavily compact something, they might have to rip it, break it up, allow. Adding mycorrhizal fungi to the mix helps break up the soil. That fungus gets out there and breaks it apart. I've got native plants growing on pure clay because we inoculate with the mycorrhizal fungi. But you also have to understand that, there's the underground, knowing that this might be an area where they'll have to go in and fix something. So don't put the diversity there, put the diversity over here. So you've got your perimeter areas, you've got your, areas in between the arrays, and then you've got the areas under the arrays. Those are, in addition to the dry, the wet, those are all the different constraints that you'll have to deal with when putting this together. And there's many ways that you can put them down. Hand seeding might be for repairs, the drill or drop seeding, broadcast seeding, frost seeding, that you put it down. Like that's the soil when the freeze-thaw cycle happens. You can see each day building up another layer of ice as the freeze-thaw is going on. And if you put the seeds in right on top of that, when that collapses with it, it plants those seeds right at the proper level. And you'll have plugs. Now what you do with plugs is to make an instant impact, or you're planting species that don't propagate well from seed or don't produce seed at all. So plugs come in generally, you know, little pots about that big, about that deep. And so you might bring something in for instant impact around the entryway or at the ends of every aisle. But, you know, plugs are expensive. It's a lot cheaper to seed something than to plant plugs in. But if you want to create habitat, you know, it's something like Culver's root, which is a really nice plant. Pollinators love it, but it rarely comes from seed in the field. But you put it in a flat in the nursery, and it grows like crazy. So it's something that each site is unique in which the species that they can use. I mean, in doing research for this, I mean, a lot of it is in the UK, but this is their, and nothing against American meadows, but this is their fescue mix. All it is no-mow fescue. So it's the stuff if you golf, that in between the fairways, that's about that tall and looks ugly in the summer because it gets really dry. That's all it is. You don't even have to go to American Meadows to buy it. You can buy it from any grass seed dealer. So it's not something that, you know, it wouldn't be uncommon to do it. But as we talk about fire, this might be something that could help. So how do we pick species? Here's the USDA plant map. You can see that this is the native range of a particular native plant. Would you plant it in that county? Yeah. Would you plant it over there? No. That's how simple it is. We use references like that. And note that plants also grow with associates. When you find one, you're likely to find another. And here's plants of the Chicago region. I mean, this is a great planting list for a solar farm if you base it on drop seed, because almost everything except a few plants in there are nice and short, because that's a dry prairie plant. So you don't want to use things like prairie dock, but gentians, they'd be really pretty. Give you the color that starts in September, August and September, you know, and is great for bumblebees. You know, early spring colors, again, you can see genetic diversity. Look at the flower color difference on these spiderwort. Canada anemone, if it's a wet area, that grows like a ground cover and just spreads out. So I mean, it'd be something that if the soil's a little bit moist, be a great plant to put in there. Or pale purple coneflower. I mean, that's a pale purple coneflower in one of our rhizotrons, but that's about as tall as it'll get. You got great, you know, flowers. It's foliage there for bugs to eat too. You know, some things like quinine. This is a fly pollinating quinine. But this is not a plant you're going to want in a solar farm. And that's common milkweed. It's the one that everybody associates with monarchs. Why? Because in a wet year, that thing can get 5 to 6 feet tall. I have milkweeds that are right by my sidewalk that are 6 feet, 7 feet tall in wet years. So it's something that we'd want those would be planted out, you know, maybe on the perimeter, but don't plant those near the panels if the panels are 3 feet off the ground. Because everybody knows those nice little parachutes that poof, they get dry on a fall day and all of a sudden poof, they're flying all over the place, and then if you knock up something to the ground, they're all there ready to go. Realize also that in doing this, you're creating habitat and that other things will come, like additional rodents, but then other things come to eat the rodents. That is my screen porch. That is a badger. Yeah, that's a weasel that has a really bad attitude. Yeah, and they're out there. But I mean, it's great. They create incredible diversity on a prairie. I mean, where the badgers went through my prairie, the violets are exploding there, which is great bumblebee habitat. But that thing has claws and teeth and probably isn't compatible with, you know, exposed wires. But also realize that those mice and those ground squirrels, a lot of what I found and learned with my truck is that the coverings of the wiring contain cornstarch or corn products, and mice like to chew them. And we're creating habitat for mice. So now, this was the thing about fire. I talked to a bunch of people and they kind of laughed, lightning strike fires. Well, we're creating a huge planting that is C4 grasses, which means they're warm season grasses, and they dry out, and they become very flammable. But you can get a spark from a cutting torch, grinding, welding, tosses their cigarette. Hopefully they're not kicking back, blowing a joint on the job site, but, lay down, fall asleep. But this is dry stuff. And I want to show you something. This is a buffalo grass, and this is my buffalo grass lawn, which would be a great plant to grow underneath because of its 8-foot deep root system. But look what happens to 3.5 inches of buffalo grass. This was 2 days ago when you light it on fire. I'm not the best videographer. Now watch it spread. What would happen if that were underneath, that mowed area underneath the solar array? I have been in fires all over the country. That scares me because the speed at which that moves on flat land, because the fuels are so contiguous, they're so fine, they dry out so fast. So I say, as part of this, and again, this is what we're having to work with. We're working with a lot of warm season plants that'll create dry things that can burn, is that if you have that, maybe one of the things to mitigate that is to get some grazing in there to knock that stuff down, to reduce the fuel continuity, to trample it down, to get it closer to the ground, to make it wet. But to me, I'm not the optimist, I'm the pessimist. And so I always look to figure out what could go wrong and try to mitigate that. So they're going to talk about the things you do in stewardship. And I'm just going to leave it there because I'm like, 10 minutes? Oh, 5 minutes. There we go. So I'll open it up to questions. Come on, I didn't put garlic in my coat. Yeah, yes, Dennis. Colleen, that's a great story, by the way.
So I want to go back to the fire question. It's come up several times. We've learned that our native landscapes have evolved with fire. They thrive with fire. Every seminar I've been to, in my own personal experience, suggests that this kind of a planting really needs fire in the long term. But then we're saying we can't do that. So I guess one question, and you showed the buffalo grass, and you don't think that's going to work. Are there sedges that we can plant? Is there anything we can plant that will allow fire? So that's the first part of my question, things that would be very low growing. The second part of my question, if fire is simply not feasible in these situations, what native plants can we plant, especially pollinators and some type of an understory grass sedge mixture, would be more likely to thrive and still be functioning as a native healthy system 10, 20 years down the road, versus turning to, a cool season grass mix and just, it's all gone. So kind of a complicated question, but a two-part question.
So my undergraduate's in horticulture. And so when you learn to grow plants ornamentally, you realize that pretty much every plant's native somewhere. Hosta's native somewhere, right? And if we look at this, we don't need fire. I'll be the first to say it. I sit on a state board that certifies burn managers. You don't need fire. You can accomplish what fire would do by just mowing it, raking it all off, and taking it away. Because what does fire do? It's a spring cleanup. It exposes the soil to sunlight, makes the soil warmer, drier. There you go. Our plants will grow fine without fire in this situation. It's a heck of a lot easier to do fire on a big area because it's, boom, done. There goes an acre, done. But in this case, you would mow, and you'd plant the plants at like cooler temperatures. So more cool season, more C3 grasses. So Canada rye, Virginia rye. What's the one with the edges? Bunch grass, or you stick your hand in it, it just has razor-like, not cordgrass. Tufted hair grass, Descampsia cespitosa. Something like that would do fine. It doesn't need to be burned. But because there's areas and you can't do that, some of these areas you might cut it and then haul it out. There might be a way to take and hay it off, at the end of the season. But, you know, I don't really see that's a problem in a solar farm. That could we design and find a mix of plants that would work where we cannot bring fire in? We just have to make sure. That's why I'm thinking with some kind of grazing, you could help pull some of that stuff out of there, that biomass. So therefore the soil's exposed.
Mike, hi. What if common milkweed would be too tall? What about other milkweeds like swamp milkweed?
Oh yeah, completely. I mean, nothing wrong with common milkweed. It's just that you give it some water and the right soils and it can get 6 to 7 feet. And if it's above those those solar panels, it's gonna block the sunlight. Any other milkweeds would do fine, as long as they don't, you know, in a wet year get really tall. And that's again why I think her suggestion of raising the bottom level of the panels is important. I know that adds steel and cable, but you know, it just makes it help a little easier for all of us on the back end.
Yeah, with the county building this year, we had butterfly milkweed and world milkweed, and we just had a banner year with monarchs. So you can use other things other than the common milkweed.
I was just wondering if you would put goats or sheep on there all season, growing season, or just at the end of the year to clean up?
I'm sorry, the goats and sheep at the...
Goats or sheep for grazing the prairie under panels, or would you just do that in the fall to clean up?
I wouldn't do it all year because, you know, obviously they'd be eating the plants as they grew. I would say that maybe as a method of being fire-wise at the end of the year, let them move through. Obviously you don't want goats because you don't want them up on the panels, but you know, you could do something, you know, rabbits would be great. Rabbits don't seem to bother electrical cables, but you want to make something that, you know, keeps that vegetation down, because you know, short fuel like that in the right conditions can be explosive. And like I said, you're welding you know, a broken arm back onto a support structure, and therefore I think that is incumbent upon the solar companies to make sure that their employees know about that, to make sure that they're fire-wise and fire-trained.
Just one other thing regarding mowing. One of the concerns is for nesting bird habitat, and our current performance standards do recommend mowing, but after September 15th, so you allow for the plants to flower and go to seed, and not after May 15th, right. Or March 15th, right. So that you've got a window to mow, but to allow for other species to thrive.
Yeah, at my home, the meadowlarks were there a week ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jack. We've heard from the agrarian community that drain tiles are super important, not only to protect, but to make sure that they function properly as existing. And from a different presenter, we saw the root system of crops versus native plants. And I don't know if you can speak to maintenance requirements or any consideration to how drain tiles are protected by planting these species.
I'm sorry, so the maintenance requirements of these native plants? Is that what you said?
I guess the crux of it is, how do we prevent the drain tiles from being clogged by the root system of these plants?
He's asking about concerns about drain tiles and native plants.
Oh, drain tiles, native plants, okay. Sorry, I wear hearing aids and they just didn't seem to adjust really well to this, so the joys of getting old and having worked around machinery. Drain tiles, not a problem. Even out on the sites that we've seen it, the drain tiles don't seem to be inhibited by the depth of the native plants and the root systems. Even on my site where I've got a couple of blown out tiles, you look down there and the native plants aren't in there. So I wouldn't worry about it. On the other hand, if you can break the drain tiles and you create restore the hydrology of an area, that will help too. So if you want them in, also replacing them before you do your solar farm, if you're worried about the solar farm is in the drainage pattern, get those replaced before you do it, because it'd be almost impossible to do it after that if those tiles blow out.
Any other last question? One more.
So without the county's requirement for using these natives, can you see other developers, solar developers, choosing to use natives because of the advantages we've been talking about?
Yeah, I can see it. I can see it. It makes sense. You know, it's also, how many people in here want to or need to employ millennials? Yeah. I have over 100 employees now. I have to employ millennials and I have to keep them. If you do something, they all want to save the world. That's the one way you can keep them engaged, is that if they know that the company's doing the right thing. And turf grass versus natives, that's the right thing. And the millennials will want to be there as part of that company. If you're just doing it the same old way, man, I don't care if you pay them $1 more, I've watched them walk. So that's a really important thing about keeping the millennials and planting natives.
And this will be our last question now.
Lucky me. Thank you. So we've been working with the county on, getting the native pollinator plants in the Unified Development Ordinance. But do we have anybody here from any municipalities? Because that's something that the environmental defenders will be advocating for as well, to be sure that our villages and our cities are also, when they are putting in solar, community solar, will be doing the same thing. I don't know if we have anybody here, but we will definitely be advocating for that going forward.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't dealt with any municipal solar, but we know that the municipalities and the park districts are all putting in, and restoring natural areas. So I don't think it would be hard to flip the switch to have them go, all right, let's do it over there, and if they have solar panels in their community.
Thank you so much, Jack.
Oh, you're welcome.
Can we have a hand of applause for Jack and Vince and Colleen? Bill Stoll is the senior ecologist with Applied Ecological Services. He has 20 years of professional experience in ecological assessment and management of natural, disturbed, and restored areas. He also has extensive project management experience on large-scale ecological studies and restoration projects. And he'll be sharing information today about monitoring and management recommendations for natives under solar farms. So, welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Cindy, and good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Bill Stoll. I work for Applied Ecological Services. Many of you probably know us as AES. And I am here this morning to talk about monitoring and management of native vegetation in solar farms. So, monitoring, I'm one of the later speakers. That's because monitoring management is kind of at the end of the whole restoration or native plant installation process. But to do monitoring and management well, you need to start at the beginning. And so you need to start with the end in mind. You need to identify your goals. There's no sense in managing without knowing what your goals are. I know I heard one of the other speakers say that before. So how do you develop goals for a restoration project or native species installation project? Well, you talk to the client, specifically with a solar farm project. You need to know the client's objectives, the project owner's objectives. You need to know the regulatory requirements, and you need to know the stakeholders' desires. So who are the stakeholders? Stakeholders would also, aside from the project owner, the solar farm company that you'd be working for, it would be the landowners, the neighbors, the local community. So all these have input into the project objectives and ultimately the goals. So you need to identify those from the onset. So that starts that's the beginning of the native vegetation installation and management plan process. So the first thing you want to do when you start planning any restoration project, whether it's in a solar farm or elsewhere, you want to assess the current conditions of the site, the vegetation, the soils, the hydrology, the site context. And then you developed your planting plan and your species mixes for that specific site in the different zones that you're going to identify or plan for in that site. And then the first step in actually installing it is site prep. And Jack talked a lot about that. I think Vince talked about that too, but that is critical for any successful native planting or restoration project. And again, I'm talking about maintenance and monitoring. If you want to make your management of a site easier or more successful, you have to do the appropriate site prep. So it's usually herbiciding off all the weeds before you start. There's various ways you can do that. And in a site like a solar farm, the site's going to be disturbed beforehand, so probably a couple herbiciding applications before you start and install any native plants would be appropriate. And then the installation, and then we get to monitoring and managing the site. And you're monitoring and managing the site to achieve the project goals. And again, your species list that Jack talked a lot about, and your planting zones that you identified, that also, you have to keep the project goals in mind when you're developing all those. And a management plan that you develop for any restoration project, and in particular for solar farms, it's really a framework, is what it is. You're identifying the tools, the techniques, and you're giving a framework of when is the most appropriate time, or typically the appropriate time to use those tools. But it's just that, it's a framework. And you have to have an adaptive management approach where you're flexible, and that's why monitoring is there, because you're going to monitor each year, probably multiple times, to assess the conditions and then adjust your management strategy. So this is a project that we helped design in Wisconsin. Our experience with solar farms is that we're doing management, currently management on 4 sites in Minnesota, starting 8 sites in New York, and we're involved in the planning of 2 sites in Wisconsin. This is one of the sites in Wisconsin. This is an early, not a final version. This is not, the project has not been finalized yet. The plans have not been finalized. And this is one of our planting plans. You can see the gray is just a grassy mix. The orange, yellow, and purple identify different mixes. One is a pollinator, a general pollinator mix. One is a high diversity mix. One is a butterfly specific mix with a bunch of milkweeds in it. And this is a cross section of that plan too, showing where the native plantings are going in between the rows and the arrays. So a couple things to note, like other speakers have noted, we have lowered profile mixes here. You may put a higher profile mix along the edge of the property to provide some screening. So for management, what do we do for management? Well, as I alluded to earlier, we have a typical toolbox of tools and methods we use in native planting management. And that, as Jack talked about earlier, that includes prescribed burning, spot or herbiciding, and mowing. So we have to adjust our typical approach to management for a solar, for working within a solar array. So what does that mean? That means, well, we can't burn, and there's going to be more mowing. But we'll still be doing some herbiciding, and we'll reseed in areas that may need it. And again, that's where the monitoring comes in play. You're out there assessing the site, determining if there's any remedial work you need to do. So in management, we break it up into kind of 2 phases. The first phase, the establishment phase, that's the critical phase for establishment, for getting the native seeds, native plants that you're installing established, and getting the weeds under control, the non-native invasive weeds under control. So the goal, so you want to reduce or remove those invasive species and weedy species. And then the fourth, beyond that, after the 3 years, we call that the maintenance phase, and basically you're just trying to keep weeds that you've controlled, you're trying to keep them from recolonizing. So you've seen this before. I think Colleen had this up on her slide too, that native plantings take a while to develop, and they look a little messy and unruly at first, but really in that third year, you do see a leap where it just kind of pops. But again, it pops in the third year if you've done the appropriate planning ahead of time and the appropriate site prep and selected the right seed for the right location. So I know I'm going over things that were talked about in earlier presentations, but you can't talk about management unless you put it in the context of the full restoration project. So when we typically do a restoration, prairie restoration, we'll go out and mow 2 or 3 times in the first year to keep the annual weeds, the biennial weeds down. We'll go out and spot herbicide a couple times. Next year you might mow twice, and then just go out and spot herbicide 2 times. Third year, you may mow, but you're probably not going to mow, and then you'll spot herbicide a couple times, and then you start burning. Well, so because we're at a solar farm, we have to adjust that. So again, this is mowing for vegetation management, and then I'll talk about mowing for operational management for the solar farm itself. So we would typically mow maybe 3 times in the first year, a couple times the second year. Again, that prevents, as I just went over, the annuals and the biennials. And it also, what mowing does for an early establishment of a prairie is that the weeds, a lot of them are cool season, and they'll come up quicker than the more slowly establishing native species. So you're preventing the weeds from shading out the newly emerging natives. So that's another reason to mow. And because we can't burn, mowing also is helping control weedy or woody invasives as well. Again, how high you mow and what time, well, you want to mow before the annuals and biennials start to set seed. And that's usually when they're about knee high, and you want to mow it anywhere between 6 and 12 inches. But when you're managing a native planting in a solar farm, I hope you guys can hear me. If you can't hear me, if I walk away from the mic, just somebody raise your hand. When you're mowing or when you're managing a native planting in a solar farm, you have to also do it for operational purposes. You have to keep the vegetation below the solar panels, otherwise it's defeating the purpose. And you start with this in the planning, that you're speccing low-profile native mixes between the rows and the arrays. And typically the panels are 3 feet. I think Colleen's, but I know that tracking panels can be as low as 12, 18 inches. That's going to be, any native planting, that's going to be problematic, and you're going to have to mow to keep the vegetation below that. So I agree completely with Colleen's suggestion that if we can have panels at least 30 inches high, 2.5, 3 feet high, that's going to make maintenance a lot easier, a lot more successful, and a lot more cost effective. But as the prairie and the native plantings mature, the vegetation is going to be more robust. During the middle of the season, after it's established, you may have to, depending on the height of the panels and what mix you put in there, you may have to mow more than 3 times just to keep it below the panels. So the equipment, what do we use for mowing? Well, you want to have a mower deck that has the appropriate width, depending on the size of the rows between the panels. You're typically using a mower deck, and having one with a swing arm to reach under the panels is really effective. You could use, if the panels are really low, you could use a weed whip under that, but you can imagine, I think it was Colleen talking about the cost when you get people out there to actually do very specific jobs, the cost of maintenance goes way up. So on a larger site, it's just not practical. So raise up the panels. You can use, it's been talked about in previous discussions about the thatch and the potential fire hazards so that may cause. So a way to address that is, as Colleen mentioned, using a mulch mower or a flail mower as well. And we're anticipating, as the solar industry booms and you get more the larger solar farms going in, that there may be specialized equipment just for solar farms being developed. And we're hoping it goes that route. Herbiciding. So the mowing does a great job with the annuals, but you're going to have persistent weeds such as thistle that's going to stick around, and you're going to have to herbicide, spot herbicide. Again, we typically do it 2-3 times first year and once or twice first couple years and once or twice after that. You may have to stump treat some woody invasives that hold on, especially if they're near the panels. But the mowing should take care of most of the woodies, the woody invasives. So again, proper management requires monitoring so we know what's going on in the site. And the reason you monitor is to document the site's performance and to provide feedback and direction to the guys doing, the crews doing the management. There's 2 types of monitoring we do. We do qualitative monitoring and we do quantitative monitoring. So most of the monitoring we'll do for an area like a solar farm would be quantitative. You just go in, you evaluate the conditions, what's the cover, approximately what percent native, non-native, where are the invasive species, are there erosion problems, etc. But if you have certain performance standards, you could do that qualitatively just by going out and observing, but often it requires quantitative data collection. And so in our experience at the sites that we monitor in Minnesota, they have the Minnesota scorecards, and to be certified, I'll actually show those in a moment, but the quantitative data is going to be aligned with when the performance standards kick in. So if they're 3rd-year performance standards, you're going to want to take quantitative the 3rd year. You're probably going to actually want to take them the 2nd year to know where you are so you can prep for the 3rd year. 1st year, it's usually not that informative. So also, someone mentioned NPDES requirements. Part of the monitoring at a solar farm is for your SWIP. You need to go out and make sure there's no erosion after, every 7 days or after rain, half-inch rainfall. And that's actually one of our sites we're monitoring in Minnesota that I think is a winter wheat cover crop there. So it looks like it's pretty good erosion control there. So this is the examples from one of our sites that we're monitoring in, managing and monitoring in Minnesota, the performance standards. And these are driven by the, they're driven, I believe, by the scorecard, the pollinator scorecard that has been adopted by Minnesota. And then in this county, I think it's Stearns County, they require as a condition of the special use permit that they become certified. And so these are the performance standards they have met to allow them to meet that certification. You get a certification, Colin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, for planning. If you plan appropriately, there's a scorecard for planning, then there's a scorecard for establishment after 3 years. These are the performance standards in one of the sites we're monitoring. So 95% of the site will be vegetated, 75% of the cover will be comprised of natives, and at least 25 native species will be present on the site, and that non-native or invasive species shall not be more than 5%. Here's the Illinois, or the version I could find, the draft version. And so some of the things that are, this is the Illinois Pollinator Habitat Planning Scorecard. So this is what you're basically scoring your plan. And again, there's another one 3 years later. And so some of the things they focus on for these, I think it's easier for me to read it up here, is the flowering plant diversity on the site, the plant diversity in the rows, the percent cover by wildflowers, which actually they don't stick to just natives, but they're still pollinator, good for pollinators. Percent dominated by native species. Do you have seasonal bloom? Let's see, what else do they, is there nearby habitat? Do you have an appropriate management plan? What's your seeding rate, et cetera? So these are some of the things that you need to have in your plan, and then you're scored on that, and your score is high enough, then you become certified. This is in Minnesota, this is the Illinois example, but nobody's requiring this yet, is my understanding. It's all, so, but it's in the works. And this is the Minnesota Establishment Scorecard. So after 3 years, To keep your certification, you need to still meet these standards. And again, it's a lot of the same thing. Percent native cover, percent cover by flowers, diversity of flowers. Do you have it blooming across the season? Are you in the context of other habitat, et cetera? Are you, how much, do you have 2% cover of milkweeds for pollinators? Are you using insecticides on site? Things like that. So, that's my summary of how you manage and monitor and manage a site, a solar farm site that's planted to natives. But stepping back a bit, what are the benefits? And Colleen and others have talked, and Jack have talked about the benefits of using natives in a solar farm setting. And so I wanted to kind of go over that again. So what are the benefits? Well, the benefits are soil benefits, both stability of the soil and fertility of the soil. Water benefits. I think Colleen talked a lot about the deep roots and how it helps infiltrate the water, preventing erosion, recharging groundwater. All those are great benefits. So all those water benefits lead to watershed benefit. Any site downstream, down gradient of this solar farm that's adapted all these practices is going to reap the benefits of the erosion control measures that have been put in place at the solar farm. There's habitat benefits we talked a lot about for pollinators, for other wildlife, for habitat connectivity. There's biodiversity benefits as well for the vegetation, the insects, the wildlife, and for aquatic life, if you think about it, because you're protecting water quality, so you're protecting aquatic life in the streams down gradient of the site. There are agricultural benefits, attracts and sustains pollinators if you're in an agricultural area where they have pollinator-dependent crops. There's weed control, there's erosion control, and it's been discussed earlier, added revenue for the farmers, for the owners of this property. It's another revenue source. There's climate benefits as well. You reduce the release of carbon because you're not tilling the soil each year, you're not using fertilizers. You're sequestering carbon because you're building organic matter in the soil, and that's helping retain, absorb, if you will, carbon. And you're reducing carbon emissions because ideally the solar farm's replacing energy that's being produced by burning fossil fuels. So it's a climate win-win situation all around. And the aesthetics, it's attractive to the property owners, the neighbors, the community. That's another benefit. And what I didn't talk about at all was, well, I did mention it once, was screening. So you can do some creative ways of maybe putting in some screening around the edges, using the higher vegetation because you're no longer in the arrays of the panels, and or native shrubs and trees. And out of these larger benefits grow client benefits. So when you establish native vegetation in these solar farms, you get stakeholder acceptance. Because they're more attractive and they have all these benefits, you get buy-in from the property owners that would be leasing the property. The neighbors are more likely to accept this, the local communities, and the local government. And as a result, it's going to streamline the permitting process. It improves stormwater management and any costs associated with that, and lower maintenance costs because you're not going to be mowing turf. So that is my presentation. Again, my name is Bill Stoll from Applied Ecological Services. We've been in business for 40 years, started in Wisconsin. That's where our headquarters is. Most of our work has been in the Chicago area over those 40 years. We do everything from start to finish in ecological restoration consulting. We do the permitting, the planning, the design, the installation, the maintenance, the monitoring, research, et cetera. I'm sure most of you have heard of us, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. So my question, it's been mentioned a couple of times, and you just touched on it, is doing the taller natives as screening. But how do you control their seeds from going into your solar array area?
That's a really good question, because I've seen it myself.
I had help.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So there are some natives that are particularly aggressive, big blue stem, and even Indian grass. So you may want to stay away from those and maybe plant switchgrass. The tall grasses are really aggressive. Yeah, sure. Any of the taller forbs would be good too. There's a whole array of what you could do a higher forb ratio, which aren't as aggressive as the grasses. That's a good suggestion. Yep.
Just along those lines, perhaps maybe not silphiums, other species that might get overly aggressive. I guess, do you have opinion on silphiums or other species that can really take hold? Because I've seen species lists specific for screening that include a lot of species that I would consider aggressive, and it kind of makes me nervous that these things are out there. Would you consider silphiums to be inappropriate?
Not as aggressive as the grasses,
Yeah.
but yeah, sure. You see silphiums, you see them in swaths.
Right.
They seem to spread. But the tall grasses I've seen just take off.
Right.
Yes, that's have to be looked at closely. What species you select for the screening, for sure. Sure.
More of a statement and not a question. My name is Kara Downen. I'm with the Soil and Water District in Knox County. But we do a lot of planning for CRP, so pollinator habitat for a CRP planting conservation reserve program. And as far as the farm bill goes, we are not allowed to put switchgrass in a pollinator habitat mix because it's more of a sod forming grass, and we find our experience has been that it's been more aggressive and it'll take over any of the forbs that you plant. So with what we are allowed to do with farm bill mixes is just the clump bunch grasses. But yeah, big blue stem is not one of them either. So just wanted to point that out, at least from our experience.
Good point. Yeah, good point.
Bill, one other thing about screening, I was just reminded that our county ordinance requires native trees and shrubs. So a fairly limited palette for us to choose from there. I guess, do you have any thoughts that that you could recommend as far as native trees and shrubs that could meet the screening requirements?
That's a good question. I mean, you could use viburnums, you could use dogwoods. Those established pretty easily.
Okay, I'm being told they require 4 feet tall at time of installation.
It has to be 4 feet tall?
4 feet tall at time of installation.
As a shrub. That's tough to do. So may want to think about that requirement.
Well, and even availability was another concern.
Yeah, that's going to be tough. Yeah, I'm serviceberry. I have serviceberry at home, so that's a good one too. Yep.
Yeah. I was just going to address that question. We've proposed cardinal dogwoods on our solar sites that are in McHenry County, which meet the native planting requirements.
Okay. They were 4 feet tall at installation, is that what you're saying?
Well, if our site is chosen, they will have to be, but yeah, the cardinal dogwoods are, I mean...
If you count the pot, I think you can get 4 feet.
Yeah, so, but I mean, they're hardy, they're red in the winter, they're green in the summer, and they do very well in this climate. They do well in Minnesota and Wisconsin, so, yeah.
Great.
Okay, that's the last of our questions for Bill. Thank you very, very, very much, Bill, for all your information.
You're welcome. Everybody had
issues and actively works with homeowners and business property owners to improve the environmental conditions of their sites. He'll be sharing his experience with converting turf to prairie with the hopes of sending us all off with a desire to put everything that we've learned today to good use. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Cindy. So that was a great introduction. I'm not even doing that stuff anymore. Some of it. I was buying land for open space and doing conservation easements. I think the easement, that question came up earlier about easements. I think these solar panels and easements would fit together very well so that people would feel that the land was protected even beyond the 25 years, that it would either be renewed into solar or turned into prairie or turned over to the park district or some kind of a situation where people feel more comfortable if they live nearby. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for other things to happen. So what I am, my specialty, I'm not the biologist, I'm not the ecologist, I'm the salesman. And I have an MBA in marketing, and I came to work for a conservation group and just realized we stink at selling the concepts. We would go around saying we do good things, and that doesn't cut it. So Jack had a great slide about, you know, if we did along the creeks and rivers, we would be able to protect this much, and if we did parks and forest preserves, we'd protect this much. If we did homeowners associations and all the land. And so I realized that we're not going to make conservation an everyday term unless everybody is involved. And everybody has a home, everybody has a place of business. And so how do we engage those people? And so my part of it is working for a land trust. We have no vested interest in it. So I don't work for a group that's doing the restoration. I don't work for somebody who has anything to do with making any money from the solar company. So when we come out and talk to groups, whether it be a park district group or whoever it is, we come from a clean position of we're just telling you environmentally this is a better way to go. So sometimes the message coming from a conservation group is accepted more by the public. And you've heard a lot of the scientists today and people talking about how this is a great concept. We've understood today how it has deep roots and it does pollinator values and there's a lot of good things about it. But if we can't sell it, if we can't make people believe it, if we can't people want it, then it's not going to fly. So there's a lot of reasons why we want to have not-for-profits, and we belong to a organization called LTA, the Land Trust Alliance. And it doesn't matter if you lived in Florida or California or wherever, there are small land trusts like ours that are spread across the country. In McHenry County, there's a separate organization, Lake County, Cook County. We work in Kane, DuPage, Kendall, Will, Grundy, LaSalle. And so these small land trusts are able to provide these functions for groups. And what we're selling are the benefits of nature. And we have to kind of understand a little bit that every single person, it's not like you're looking at a nature guy or Jack was a nature guy. We all have this inside of us. We want it. Where do we go on vacation? We go to Hawaii, we go to Wisconsin. The best stories we have of places we've engaged in natural communities. So bringing this to our home area and along roads and places that we visit is a natural thing. It may take some convincing, and I think that's what we have to work on a little bit is how do we talk to people about conservation measures. So I think one of the ways we're visual animals. This was a site in Naperville where we converted the left to the right. And when I show the before and afters for these sites, there's very little question that one is looking better, one can provide function, one is absorbing water and feeding butterflies and all these good things that are happening. But there's still that concern of what's it going to look like. And there's a way to put features into these landscapes that will help the general public. And I don't think we think of selling birds and butterflies. We think of, a lot of people think sales is a bad thing. And, you know, if you're a salesman, but it's what you're selling. And everybody is in sales at one place or another. We're trying to convince or be persuasive in our actions. And I have a lot to sell in the way of better environmental conditions. So this is what my portion of this is, and I'll show you some pictures of what we've done. We use things like the monarch as our poster child. They touched a little bit earlier about it can bring salamanders or snakes or fox or different creatures to the landscape. We in this group, we understand biodiversity and the need for all of that. The general public still, if I told them it brings snakes, not going to happen. Even bees are a touchy subject. Some people like bees, but we build these butterfly gardens. Pollinators is a softer way of saying bees. You know, pollinators is such a nice word. But I think it's 90% of the pollination is done with bees. But we put this beautiful monarch up here as the poster child, and we're trying to save these poor monarchs, and everybody loves the story. So this is what we're doing. I think even in the name of what we're talking about, I heard a lot of talk about prairies. And I've just found in my expertise or my experiences that even prairie is a bad connotation. So when for a while I was going out saying, I can take the scary out of your prairie. But I hear people saying, what about the lions and tigers and bears? Oh my. You know, that you know, there's still, people talk about stuff jumping out of me at the prairie, or that big stuff flops over and I can't see the pond anymore. And so I've abandoned doing prairies on these sites that require short plantings. So my new thing that I'm out promoting is a meadow. So I extensively ask people, tell me about a meadow. And I put the microphone in their mouth, right in their face. And the number one answer was Julie Andrews and The Sound of Music. Oddly enough, the second answer was when they think of meadow, when Dorothy comes out of the nasty forest and she can see the Emerald City. Those are poppies. But the idea is a fairly flat, low profile, flower-filled surface. And if we can have people think of that, so this meadow even comes off your mouth, it's a nicer word. So this is what I'm trying to sell, is this concept of a pollinator meadow. And we can change the seed, we can adapt it to fit these sites. First, we have to have general acceptance. And so I went around trying to sell the concept. And my feeling is when I can sell it to the toll road, then you got something. So the front slope, I'm not even interested. It's salt filled. It's going to have broken car parts. But the back slope, they're converting to meadow. And it's 50%, 60% less costly. So you can see, if we can apply this to tollways, we can apply it to corporate sites, we can apply it to solar farms, we can apply these everywhere. We have the expertise with the PISOs, the applied ecologicals, the NCAPs, the tall grass, and all of the companies that can do the work. Now we need to create more demand. And so I go around asking people, you know, the number one surface covering 39 of the lower 48 states is turf. In Illinois, there's more turf than corn and soybean combined. So if I'm looking at what do we want to do to make things more environmentally friendly across our neighborhoods, it would be reduce the turf. And people won't do it with, I mean, they've had opportunities to leave the prairie there and it's gone. So we need a new thought pattern, and I'm pitching the concept of the meadow. So I go out to people, this is right in Geneva along the Fox River, and left or right, which one's prettier? Which one's feeding birds and butterflies? Which one is blooming in the middle of a drought? So these visualizations of all those comprehensive technical things that's happening. The soil is cooler, it's increasing the carbon imprint on the soil, all that good stuff. You have to bring it to people in visualizations, and I think we haven't done it enough. We don't have, I mean, Jack talked about taking the pictures of the solar panels off the internet because we don't have enough before and afters of solar projects. So we need to build that. We need to find the right seed mixes that work. And it's going to be a trial and error, and we're going to work at it. We're going to get it right. But having places and having things where we can introduce these concepts to people and invite them to experience these areas and not be afraid of them, is one of the things that I'm working on all the time. And you sell the benefits of what you're getting from it. So everybody, there's a certain amount of conversation when you're talking to somebody and you're trying to be persuasive. What's in anybody, all of our minds is, what's in it for me? What is this going to, how is this going to make my life better? So some of the things that we can easily show them, you know, if you lived next to a pond and you wouldn't have the geese there anymore, or if it was going to be less costly for your homeowners association, or you could keep the erosion down. So some of these projects, we walk them through what's going on. You know, there's going to be some prep time going on. There's going to be some equipment. We're going to have to live through those steps of the process, show people that it's not going to happen overnight, but that we will get to the point where it's going to be pretty and do these functions. So people don't understand about the deep roots and that a plant is not a plant. You know, that the adaptations, the evolutionary process of plants is every bit as great as at the animal world. So when I'm out talking to people, I teach at college level, and we talk about evolution, the first thing they talk about is, yeah, these turtles have developed a shell that they can carry around for protection, or this giraffe has this goofy looking neck that can eat the acacia leaf. They understand the evolution of animals. But bringing that to a plant and educating them that these plants have evolved with these root systems that do all of the stuff that they survive in Illinois. We have cold, sleet, hail, all this stuff. They've survived for years and years. And plants like the silphiums, I heard about that. I mean, the compass plant will track the sun's movement, it turn itself. So some really cool things that we can sell as concepts and kind of bring that aha moment to people to say, like, you know, I never really thought about that plants are essential for all life on this planet. So again, we have to then take those benefits and put them in pretty pictures. I started the Conservation at Home program, which now we have 8 different organizations running it across Illinois and parts of Michigan. The idea is to sell these concepts, go to their properties, help them with it, and get buy-in so that then we can call upon these contractors to implement the programs. The ditch. We're not calling them a ditch anymore. We're going to make them a bioswale. And this dead ditch that held water is going to be planted with native plants that are going to, the water won't sit there anymore, and we won't have to worry about Zika virus and the mosquitoes that are breeding in this water puddle. And we're going to turn it into this bioswale, which is a functioning, living swale that's going to absorb that water. And maybe we do need to plant this. In some of the cases, this was a park site, and they wanted it, they want this thing to boom. They didn't have time for crawl, sleep, leap. So we planted it with an annual cosmos, and it bloomed right away. And then that was the difference of getting it off the ground or not. So the maintenance has to be upkept. I like the fact that I heard over and over today that maintenance is an increasingly, I guess, under-managed sites we've seen, and many of them have failed, so there's been problems with it. They haven't done dedicated funding so that these areas become maintained on a regular basis, and working with the companies that are out there doing it so that these quality sites continue to look nice. When we have these, I can't do anything better than showing pictures of successful sites. And we've implemented these meadows on many different sites and had great success with some of them. Some of them we're still learning on how we're going to do this better with different types of soils. But when we've done, this was behind a bank in Elmhurst, and successful conversions, the people are very happy with it, It used to hold water about 3 months out of the year, and the water is now gone. At the farm, we've worked both with, we have a site that Pizzo has restored our wetland, and Applied Ecological has done our meadow out by the road. Our swath is 25 feet wide, and it runs 1,400 lineal feet along a regional bike trail. So a lot of people are going to be exposed to this native area, and we have interpretive signage along the trail so that people can see it and kind of understand that we're sequestering carbon here and that we're feeding the monarch and we're doing all these good things that they may not notice. You know, the typical question or typical comment I might get, oh, the flowers are pretty. But bringing that education that it's a lot more than just pretty flowers going on here. There's an ecosystem function. And then people want to be recognized. So if you're going to do the work, you're going to convert it, you're going to change and make things better for the environment. Let's take pictures of it. Let's get it in the paper. Let's say this company is doing the right thing and get other people to jump on board. So if it means bringing a plastic sign, recognizing somebody for doing something good, that's been an incentive. I had one guy that came to me and he said, my wife wants one of those for our prairie area. And I said, well, you can't just say, I want one. And he says, oh, yes, I can. I have a checkbook. And he says, what would I have to do to make this acceptable so that I could get your certification? And I said, okay, that's the right answer. And in a way, he was right. A checkbook will take care of some issues. He could have had maintenance and whatever. He got his sign, and his wife was happy. And what they say, happy wife, happy life. But you get people smiling, you get good publicity. Sometimes there's somebody in the organization that is not so much on board. When they get their picture in the paper, there's some buy-in. So my portion here today is to offer to help you sell your projects and to, when I'm out talking to park districts, for example, the park district's #1 reason they don't convert more areas to native is because they think people will hate it. People will scream. I was in the village of Glen Ellen, and they had bought a house and knocked it down. It had flooded repeatedly, and they bought the house, knocked it down, and they were saying, we're thinking of putting sod there. And I was like, come on, it's a flood zone. And they said, well, people are going to scream. And I said, let's have a meeting, and I'll stand up there and let them scream at me. Well, for whatever reason, the not-for-profits, I represent Bambi and all that is good in the world. So when I say this is better for the environment, it's going to absorb water, it's going to do all these good things, they go, oh, wow, I didn't know that. Where if the city had said that, we're going to turn this into a prairie, they're going to go, you're just too lazy to, you don't want to mow it. So I explained to the people there that, do you really want the city to put grass in there? Do you think the city is going to keep the dandelions down? And do you think the city is going to maintain this like a golf course? Probably not. And we don't want to, bring mowers and all these other things. So that's what I can bring to the way I highly suggest anybody doing projects that you engage your local land trust and get the buy-in and get people talking about the right things. And I will take any questions you might have about what I'm trying to do.
Thank you, Jim.
You're welcome. I have materials on the table here if you want. My card and business information is on the information there too.
I just wanted to start out and ask you this. You mentioned using signage when you do conservation at home. Would you recommend to all of the solar developers that when they plant their meadows under their solar farms, should they have some signage to help the public understand and get more buy-in?
Certainly.
Good idea.
We've certified hundreds of, we have conservation at home for residential sites and conservation at work for sites that don't have people living on them. So we try to reach everybody with that type of thing and get publicity for that.
I'll elaborate on that as well. The Land Conservancy of McHenry County has adopted the Conservation at Home and Conservation at Work program here in McHenry County. And so individual homeowners can contact the Land Conservancy and get some guidance on how to integrate native plants into your home landscaping. The county building, I help oversee the native landscaping at the county building. The county is now a Conservation at Work garden. So, you know, we have this here in McHenry County as well. Who were you pointing at?
Jim, is that the DuPage Unitarian Universalist Church?
Yes.
Okay, I just saw that last week.
Mary Alice has her yard certified and done some work in her homeowners association. So a lot of people that have seen and had benefit from the publicity we can get. I'm not planting the plants. Thank you for doing that. And June.
Another church that has that certification, Conservation at Work, is the Unitarian Universalist Church of Elgin. Thanks to Jim.
Hey, I was just wondering, for the advertising purposes, do you ever use agricultural value as a selling point, like the boom to the farmers?
Most of the farmers, I haven't been able to sell the concept of conversion to them because they're going from a productive money-making thing. That's why one of the ideas about the solar is exciting, because the farmer that would get revenue and he's not corn and soybeans. So the benefits are solid, and I have had no luck with my farmer friend selling him to convert his waterways into native landscaping. That has not sold well with them.
I had a question on the entomology over here. So for wetlands, do you have any new words that we should be using? Because wetlands, people immediately think mosquitoes, and I can tell them all they want that the dry down period is improved with most native wetlands versus traditional or turf.
In the yards, we're calling them rain gardens. Okay. So those wet spots. And I do a lot of pictures of, I went to a homeowner association and the bottom of the basin was just mud. So when you walk out there and you see this mud hole and show them how that could be converted to a wetland with lobelia and these beautiful flowering plants, and we use heavier percentage of forbs in these areas where there's going to be people sitting on benches and things like that, so you pretty it up. Typically, people would think if I said, tell me about a wetland, they'll say, there's cattails and water. So I don't think people have a good connotation of a wetland. There's gorgeous wetlands if people would get out there and see them at certain times, but I don't think if you ask, would you want your house next to the wetland, a lot of people would say that. So we have some work to do to educate people about how wetlands can be beautiful and the function that they do and all of that. I think we have to sell those concepts better.
Thank you.
A great opportunity for integrating native plants on pretty much any property. A lot of park districts are doing this now, and Crystal Lake Park District has done a great job on this, is anywhere you have those wet spots in an open field, that's a hazardous area for maintenance purposes. It looks horrible. The vehicles, their lawnmowers get a lot of wear and tear going through those areas. If the only benefit you're deriving is the open view shed, there's no reason not to convert that to native plants. But these little depressional pockets in parks or on municipal properties can easily be converted to wetlands. So in Crystal Lake, right by Main Street Beach, they put a pollinator garden in, I guess this past summer, and it's performing wonderfully. So an area of liability, both from aesthetics and from all practical purposes, is now really a thriving habitat community. I saw more monarchs there than any other place in Crystal Lake. And so it reduces their cost, it reduces the wear and tear on their vehicles, and provides an aesthetic feature that previously had not been there. So, and it really costs them very little to implement. So these things can be done pretty much anywhere.
I have the conservation at home and at my home for a front yard prairie in Algonquin. And I live in a cul-de-sac, and it's been there for a dozen years. No one has caught on. So with everybody else's turf grass. But my question is, what would be, I mean, I kind of feel like this could be done at the grassroots level, the local level, at the village level, where there's a certain percentage homeowners' property, just a certain percentage that would need to be planted with pollinators. How else are we really going to get this to be a patchwork? Like we have Habitat National Wildlife Refuge, which is a fabulous patchwork. We could be doing that, you know, increasing that acreage so much more if there was some sort of ordinance that part of your turf has to come out, and you got to, you know, you know what I'm saying? I mean,
Well,
maybe that wouldn't.
We've done the same thing. It's good tie-in. We have a program we call Partnering with the Parks. So we go to the park districts and identify pieces of their parks that either there's a creek running through it, or it's a low area, or they're not meant for ball fields. They never will be ball fields. So why not convert those? And the same thing at the municipal level, we have conservation in our community. So we have Naperville and Downers Grove, and some of these communities are very engaged in conservation measures, and we do programs for the community members there. In Downers Grove, you can get a rain barrel at a discounted price, and you actually can do a bioswale in the ditch in front of your home, which is right away. So if the communities buy in, then we can reach their landowners. I can't, now in this day of, there's no newspapers anymore to speak of, how do you communicate? Well, we give materials to the municipality, and then they distribute them. And the same thing with the park district. So I agree that community buy-in is a big thing. So all we can do is go to the city council and say, is conservation a big thing in your community or not? And if they say, we want you to come, then we can spend more time there.
So actually, if you don't mind, could the rest of our presenters go back up toward the stage as well? And Scott, if you could stay there with your microphone, and I'll cover the audience. But Jack, if we could get you back up there. Is Vince still here? Colleen, if you could step up.
Yeah, so
and
just,
what we would like
just in the last few minutes, first let's thank Jim. And then, in kind of our last 15 minutes before we wrap up, it'd be great if folks have questions for your last minute questions for our presenters. I just also wanted to say that the folks that presented today, the firms that have tables and are tabling here, I want to say a big thank you to all of them, and remind you that they have great websites, and those are good resources to go to find more information about this issue. I had a question. This was kind of a follow-up on, I can't remember whose question it was, but there was a question about, maybe it was Nancy's, about signage. And so I had a question to the folks here, any of the solar developers, those who have been involved with solar farms. Do you have the experience of any solar farms, putting up signage about what they're doing, both what the solar installation on their site is doing and also about the habitat?
So one of the point areas on the Illinois Solar Scorecard and the Minnesota Scorecard is if you put up a sign, it's such a simple thing, a way to get 5 points, is if you put a solar sign up or a sign up that says prairie habitat in progress, and it really, anybody who's passing by, they realize it's not a weedy mess, it's something intentional. So that is on the scorecard.
Great. So looks like we got some other questions right there, Scott.
Downstate, they were putting up a lot of windmills, and they wanted me to put windmills, and it seems to be a competition between two companies. But has there been a marriage of solar panels and windmills around so that we use the same property for both of them?
If anybody in the audience has an answer to that question, there we go, back there. This is our free-for-all. We want to hear from everybody here.
We have a couple projects where we have a lease with, hi, I'm with Geronimo Energy. We have a lease for solar on a project where there is already a wind project on there. It depends on what the underlying lease is for the wind tower, and it depends on how much space you need for the community solar. So it just depends on what the individual project. But a lot of times those properties are already set up for the transmission. They have the electrical facilities.
Yeah.
They can tie in all that kind of stuff. And then the one project we have here proposed in Illinois, they actually already have a beekeeping on the site, so they were pretty excited about the solar project. So.
Great.
And I think that when they get more into utility scale, that may work it out very well. Right now, the big push is as a result of the Illinois Clean Energy Jobs Act, and the community solar farms need to be fairly close to the communities that they serve so that they can tie into the two-phase lines. So this current push, may be somewhat limited in the combination of the two. But this is really the first wave, and so we may find synergies like that in the future. But in this,
Okay, we've got a sharing of cards going on. Faye, why don't you go ahead and
Okay, we'll
ask
get you
your
a card.
question.
My question is kind of directed to Jim, and in terms of so many of the communities around are becoming more and more concerned about stormwater and about our intense rain events overwhelming their stormwater capabilities. What has anyone done, thinking a little bit about bioswales and drainage ditches, but in towns you can't do that, but programs about sedges in drainage ditches to try to slow down the water, and just wondering if there's any work being done along those lines.
In many of the communities, Elmhurst was one, and Downers Grove, they specifically have me come in talking to people about the storm drain heads, that they might be 2 miles from the river, but that they have direct connectivity with that storm drain. So planting those areas, depending on the area, certainly if it's shade, and sedges are a perfect thing for that, to cover the open soil and to absorb rainwater. So the swales are another, where there's conveyance, and a variety of these bioswales or rain gardens are a way of keeping that water out of that drain head for just days, weeks, hours, just keep it out of those systems. Because most of the communities that we work in, flooding is a major issue. So there's a lot of work that can be done utilizing natives where it's not being done now, absolutely.
Any other questions?
Well, I just had something on that question because it reminded me of someone's question earlier in the session, a question about solar farms and drain tiles. And one thing we didn't talk about is if you plant your solar farm with deep-rooted native plants, they're going to be helping to take up that water and actually reducing the amount of water that drains off the site.
Bill or Jack, maybe you could elaborate a little bit further. We've talked about how these are not natural systems, and we can't integrate fire into our routine management. So mowing is going to have to substitute the use of fire. I guess we've talked about needing to do adaptive management strategies and high mowing and other things during the establishment period. In your slides, it looked like you were talking about having to do multiple mowings per year, in perpetuity. Am I understanding that right? Because I was looking at kind of restricting the number of mowings as part of our performance standards. But I don't want to be tying anybody's hands as part of that. So I guess could you elaborate a little bit further on what you envision a good mowing regime encompassing?
Right. Fewest mowings possible would be best, but it all depends on And that's why it starts with the design process. You need to design the low profile, and the panels ideally should be at least 2.5 feet high.
Hold the mic up, please.
Okay, so sorry about that. So it all starts with the design process. You want to design the low profile mix around the panels so that you can minimize your mowing. You're mowing in the first, as I said, the first few years to get the weeds down, but after that, you don't need to necessarily. But if the vegetation gets so high that it's blocking the panel, you're going to have to. So it's a combination of factors. Design it so it doesn't block the panels, but have it as a tool if you need to. But, you know, site conditions are going to limit, you know, short stature plants typically are dry, do better under drier conditions, and if you have a site that's not amenable to drier, doesn't have drier conditions, it might be tough to get those low profile plants to establish. We've seen that. So there's a number of factors here that you have to balance, and you're probably going to have to do mowing beyond 3 years to make sure you don't block the panels. But hopefully less. If you design it right, you're going to minimize that. That's the answer. Jack, anything to
I agree. I think it's, you know, ounce prevention's worth a pound of cure. Do the right thing in the design process, but leave that tool in my toolbox. It's much like people say you don't want herbicide. No, leave it in there. Because if I need to use it, I can use it, and then, you know, I'll look to create a healthy ecosystem. Same thing with mowing. Leave it in there. But, you know, wet a site that, you know, like, oh, I want it nice and short, but it's got a deep, black, moist soil underneath it, that stuff might decide it wants to be 3.5 feet tall. And then you got to do a little bit of mowing. And I know it's not great for pollinators to cut off the flowers, but on the other hand, this is a solar facility. So.
Sort of connected to that is the timing of the mowing, because we talked about how we want to provide habitat for small mammals and nesting things. So so management of that site needs to know when is a good time, depending on what's nesting there. So that seems like a lot of observation to make sure that we're not mowing over, you know, precious things like turtle eggs and other things. So education about that.
It's another factor that you have to balance with. Yeah, that's another factor you have to balance. You have birds nesting, potentially turtles. So yeah, you're going to have to schedule your mowing around that to the extent that you can. But the operational needs of the facility, you may have to mow at a time where there are nesting birds. So you design it such that you minimize the mowing and you reduce that conflict.
Well,
Any last questions?
We have one last one, Cindy.
Okay.
So I'm wondering who's going to do, the research is getting out there, but I don't know that it's published. I see what's going to be the best possible solar mix that's going to evolve over time with experimentation, and who's publishing this, who's putting out lists of their seed mixes, who's opening up their sites for other folks to go look at. Any thoughts on that?
Happily, there will never be one best possible mix because we would want to tailor the mixes to every site. And within the state, there's going to be many mixes and within wetlands, uplands. So we try to be very forthcoming and share that information, and I think these other folks do too, because that's the only way that we really get this done right. Again, it's a young industry, and if we want to have the accepted buy-in that Jim is talking about, sharing that information and realizing, you know, what is working, and that's why some of the federal studies that are happening will be beneficial to all of us in the industry.
I think that, you know, that the open information, especially about the size of plants, I mean, is that when you're looking up to do a mix, or the county puts together an acceptable list of species to be on these sites that are within, you know, the array, then that really are those really are the species that are acceptable to be in there. And we're not going to walk in and go, well, I need my monster variety of switchgrass because it's my thing, and that's, every one of my plantings at Native Landscape Contractors has that. No, I mean, it's something that I think each individual municipality and the regulators would be able to do that with a little bit of leeway for, drop seed never occurred in that county, but you're going to allow it on there because you're not a purist, and it's an industrial facility, not a restoration. So,
I think the question right now just reminded me that for all of you solar developers in the room, the best answer to a lot of that is make sure that when you hire your landscaping contractor, that they are the contractor that knows the science of ecology, because a lot of the questions that have just been brought up, your typical landscape company is not to that. There's enough work for all of us in the room that are the environmental companies. There's enough work for all of us to do. If you're going to see success with this, it's really going to happen because you're hiring the right contractor, and those are the ones with the science base.
Great. So I want to say a last thank you to all of you for attending. I want to thank our presenters, our tablers again. As you depart, please stop by and for a last chat with the folks that are tabling. And if you want to stay and continue your conversations, you're welcome to grab some folks you want to talk to and get some lunch at the cafeteria. So thank you very much. Thank you to MCCC for all your help and for hosting us.